Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Clockmaker Who Forged Royal Seals. Section 1. The Hands of Time. You find yourself stepping into a narrow cobblestone street in late 19th century Europe, a place where the tick of clocks mingled with the hush of gossip in cafes. At the center of this story is not a murderer, not a violent robber, but a man who lived among gears, springs, and polished brass. He was a clockmaker, known in his small town for precision, patience, and an uncanny ability to replicate detail. What few realized was that his skills went far beyond keeping time. Hidden behind the respectable facade of his workshop, he used his craft to tamper with something far more dangerous: the seals of monarchs and ministries. A town built on trust. The town, nestled near a trade route, depended on the reliability of documents. Whether it was a shipment contract, a tax notice, or an edict from the crown, all bore seals, wax impressions pressed by official signet rings. These seals were symbols of power and authenticity. To the common eye, they were nothing more than colored wax, but to merchants, magistrates, and soldiers, they were absolute proof of authority. In such a society, trust flowed not only through words, but through symbols stamped in wax. If a seal bore the royal crest, it was unquestionable. That unquestioned trust is precisely what the clockmaker learned to exploit. The man behind the craft. The clockmaker's name has been partly lost to history. Records mention him under variations depending on who told the tale. Johann Meissner in one archive, Jean Munier in another. Perhaps he used aliases deliberately, slipping across borders where language is blurred. What is known is that he apprenticed under a master horologist, spending his youth bent over tiny mechanisms. His steady hands, trained to file pin-sized gears, could just as easily carve intricate designs into metal. You imagine him late at night, when the lamps in his workshop flickered low, working not on a pocket watch but on a hidden commission. With thin engraving tools, he copied crests into miniature dies, practicing over and over until the counterfeit was indistinguishable from the real thing. Wax, after all, could not protest. It yielded under heat and pressure, holding the false crest as faithfully as the true one. Why seals mattered. To modern eyes, it might seem trivial. Who would care about a stamp in wax? But at the time, seals were more secure than signatures. Few could replicate them perfectly, and forgery carried severe punishment. A single counterfeit seal could authorize a shipment of valuable goods, grant tax exemptions, or even order troop movements. Think of it this way. A forged seal in the 1800s had the same weight as a hacked government database in the present day. It gave the bearer a silent weapon, the ability to manipulate systems built entirely on trust. The first suspicions. The story begins, as so many do, with something small. In the provincial capital, a merchant submitted a customs document exempting him from certain tariffs. The seal bore the unmistakable impression of the finance ministry. Yet, when officials compared it to their records, doubts arose. The wax appeared slightly off in hue, the crest just a fraction shallower than usual. The document was waved through. No official wished to accuse a merchant of fraud without certainty. But whispers began. Soon, another case arose. A shipment of wine barrels traveling tax-free under a seal supposedly from the king's own household. This time, the document's courier vanished before investigators could question him. Patterns emerged, and officials grew uneasy. The seals were too perfect to dismiss as crude imitations. Whoever was behind them had access to remarkable craftsmanship. The clockmaker's customers. Meanwhile, in his town, the clockmaker was busy with commissions from both nobles and tradesmen. His shop became a quiet hub where travelers stopped to repair watches or order intricate timepieces. The man cultivated an image of neutrality. He was not political, not ambitious, simply dedicated to his craft. That very appearance made him invisible in plain sight. But records later showed that his clientele included men who never returned for their supposed repairs. Some left only whispered messages. It is believed that certain conspirators sought him out, not for timepieces but for seals, dies small enough to press into hot wax, replicating the authority of kings. Investigators close in. By 1872, investigators from the ministry had begun tracing the forged seals back through trade routes. Documents emerged bearing crests from multiple kingdoms, suggesting not a single rogue official, but a network. The startling consistency pointed toward a single artisan, someone capable of reproducing every nuance, from the jagged edge of a crown to the curling tail of a lion rampant. This narrowed the field. Such precision required specialized tools, files, burins, and magnification devices not commonly available. That pointed them toward jewelers, engravers, and watchmakers. Among them, the quiet man in the cobblestone town stood out. The telltale mistake. What brought him down, according to later accounts, was not a slip of hand but a slip of pride. One counterfeit seal bore a microscopic flourish, a mark not present on the original but added as his personal signature of mastery. Perhaps he thought it would go unnoticed, or perhaps he couldn't resist leaving proof of his genius. But to sharp-eyed inspectors, it was the thread that unraveled the tapestry. A pattern of seals with this hidden flourish appeared across multiple suspicious documents. Investigators now knew they were hunting a single craftsman, and their search narrowed further. Life behind the workshop doors. Imagine standing outside his shop, the bell tinkling as customers enter, unaware that beneath the counter lies a box not of gears but of dies. The air smells of oil and brass, the walls lined with ticking clocks marking the steady passage of time. He maintained this dual life meticulously. To his neighbors, he was the patient clockmaker who repaired heirloom watches. To his secret clients, he was a ghost capable of creating power with a press of his hand. One wonders what he felt in those moments. Did he justify his forgeries as harmless, just wax and metal? Or did he revel in the disruption they caused? Documents suggest he lived modestly, never flaunting wealth. Perhaps he sought not riches but the satisfaction of outsmarting systems that trusted too blindly. Authorities circle closer. By the mid-1870s, investigators had placed informants in towns along the trade routes. Suspicious couriers were followed, documents intercepted. Slowly, the net closed. Each time a forged seal surfaced, the hidden flourish reappeared, tying the cases together. And yet the clockmaker continued his work, seemingly unaware of how close authorities were. Or perhaps he knew, and simply trusted his precision to shield him. An unanswered question. The trail leads us now to the point just before his arrest, when investigators narrowed their focus to a handful of workshops. What remains uncertain is this: how much did the authorities truly know before they acted? Were they convinced beyond doubt of his guilt, or did they strike only to stop a growing crisis, hoping their suspicions were correct? This ambiguity lingers even now, leaving us with a haunting question. Was the quiet man at his bench merely a craftsman of time, or was he the architect of a silent empire built in wax? Would you like to continue to Section 2 of Story 1? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, perfect, let's continue with Story 1. The Clockmaker Who Forged Royal Seals, Section 2, 1, 502,000 words. Story 1. The Clockmaker Who Forged Royal Seals. Section 2. The Investigation tightens. The investigation against the clockmaker, though slow and deliberate, soon grew into one of the most unusual cases of bureaucratic fraud in 19th-century Europe. Unlike crimes of violence or open theft, this one crept through the seams of paper, hidden beneath wax. It is here that you step deeper into the story, into the minds of investigators, into the web of conspirators, and into the very tools that betrayed their maker. The bureaucrats who became detectives. At first, the task of unmasking the forgery fell not to seasoned police but to clerks and bureaucrats. They were men accustomed to ink and ledgers, not street chases. Yet it was precisely their obsessive attention to detail that began to crack the case. Day after day, clerks compared seals, laying documents side by side under magnifying lamps. They studied the way wax spread when pressed, the subtle ridges of the impressions, even the direction in which the die had been tilted. To the untrained eye, each crest appeared identical, but to these clerks, repetition revealed tiny patterns of flourishes in the lion's mane, dots misplaced in a crown. Behind their work was a question that kept them awake at night. If a seal could no longer be trusted, then what held the kingdom together? Following the couriers. Once officials confirmed the existence of a master forger, they turned their attention to those who carried the documents. Couriers became the weak link. They were the ones who presented the papers at customs gates, the ones who vanished when suspicions grew. Some were caught and interrogated. A few confessed, admitting they had been given sealed papers by a craftsman who asked no questions. Others refused to speak, fearing the shadowy network behind the forgeries more than prison itself. From these fragments, investigators pieced together a map of trade routes, lines stretching across borders, converging back toward the town where the clockmaker lived. It became clear. The heart of the forgery ring was not in the capital, nor in the bustling ports, but in an unassuming workshop filled with ticking clocks. The secret of the tools. How exactly did the clockmaker create such convincing forgeries? The answer lay in the same precision instruments he used to adjust tiny cogs. Files meant for shaping gears were sharpened into engraving tools. Magnifying lenses, built to study escapements, gave him the ability to replicate minute details invisible to most eyes. Historians later found descriptions of the dies he created. Small discs of steel, each engraved with a crest so fine it could reproduce the hairlines of a horse on a coat of arms. When pressed into wax, the result was flawless. No signature of hand remained, only the authority of the seal. It was, investigators realized, the perfect crime for a man who understood the tyranny of detail. The network expands. The clockmaker did not act alone. Evidence suggests he provided seals to groups ranging from smugglers to political agitators. Smugglers used his work to pass shipments tax-free, eroding government revenues. Agitators used them to distribute pamphlets appearing to bear official sanction, spreading discontent under the cover of royal authority. In this way, his forgeries became more than theft. They became a quiet weapon against the structures of governance themselves. Each forged seal was a whisper of doubt, a small tremor beneath the weight of bureaucracy. Pressure from above. By 1875, ministers in the capital were alarmed. Revenues dropped as fraudulent exemptions multiplied. Officials hesitated to act on sealed documents, fearing they were false. Trust, the very currency of administration, began to fray. The order came down. The forgery ring must be stopped, not merely for financial reasons, but to restore faith in governance. It was no longer a matter of petty crime. It was now considered an act bordering on treason. Watching the watchmaker. Local authorities under pressure began discreet surveillance of the clockmaker's shop. Informants lingered outside, pretending to wait for repairs. They noted who entered and who left. Several visitors were strangers, men who never returned. Some carried satchels. Others appeared nervous, glancing over their shoulders. The watchmaker himself remained calm. He kept his hours regular, greeted neighbors with courtesy, and delivered completed clocks to the town square. To outward appearances, he was the model of respectability. But late at night, through thin curtains, a glow remained long after other shops closed. The grind of tools, the steady scratch of engraving, carried faintly into the street. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A courier caught near the border carried a forged customs exemption. Under interrogation, he admitted he had received the seal from a man of clocks. Pressed further, He described the shop with unnerving accuracy. The brass pendulum in the window, the painted sign with gilded numerals. It was the confirmation authorities needed. The suspicions circling the clockmaker now hardened into a target. The raid. On a cold morning, officials arrived quietly, avoiding the spectacle of an arrest that could panic the town. Two plainclothes officers entered under the pretense of repairing a pocket watch, while others waited outside. At a signal, they moved. The workshop was searched from top to bottom. Beneath a false drawer in the workbench, investigators uncovered a box of steel dies, dozens of them, each bearing the crest of a different office or kingdom. Wrapped in cloth, they had been organized with the precision of a craftsman. Alongside them lay sticks of wax in royal colors: crimson, emerald, violet. The evidence was undeniable. Here was the machinery of deception, laid bare in the very place that had seemed so harmless. The clockmaker's response. When confronted, the clockmaker did not panic. Witnesses recorded that he stood calmly, wiping his hands on a rag. His only words at first were, "You will never prove which are mine and which are theirs." It was a cryptic statement, perhaps a final act of defiance, perhaps an attempt to imply he was only a tool in a larger conspiracy. In that moment, he seemed less like a criminal caught in his act and more like a man who had long accepted that discovery was inevitable. Interrogation and silence. Taken to the capital, the clockmaker faced days of questioning. Who had commissioned the seals? To whom had he sold them? What purpose did they serve? To each, his answers were evasive. Sometimes he claimed ignorance, other times he responded with silence. On rare occasions, he offered cryptic phrases: "Power needs a craftsman. I am only the craftsman." Investigators grew frustrated. They had captured the artisan but not the network. Without names, without connections, the case remained only half solved. And so the deeper mystery emerges. Was the clockmaker merely a hired hand, or was he the mastermind of the entire operation? A question left hanging. The records of his interrogation end abruptly, as if certain details were deliberately suppressed. Some documents hint at high-ranking officials being implicated, men too powerful to expose. Others suggest that entire lines of questioning were stricken from the archives. What remains clear is this: the clockmaker's arrest was not the end of the forgery crisis. In fact, his silence may have been more dangerous than his craft. Which leads to the unsettling question. If he was only the artisan, then who were the men in the shadows, the ones who profited from his skill? Would you like to continue to Section 3 of Story 1? You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, "Excellent, let's bring this first crime story to its conclusion." Here is Story 1. The Clockmaker Who Forged Royal Seals, Section 3, 1, 502,000 words. Story 1. The Clockmaker Who Forged Royal Seals. Section 3. Trial, Consequences, and Legacy. The capture of the clockmaker was, for the government of the time, both a triumph and a dilemma. They had removed from circulation the most dangerous artisan of his age, yet they had not destroyed the network that relied on him. The trial that followed was as much about saving face and restoring trust as it was about punishing one man. The trial begins. The trial opened in the provincial capital's Grand Hall. Citizens crowded the steps, whispering in disbelief that the quiet watchmaker, the man who had repaired their father's pocket watches and tuned the town's clock tower, was accused of undermining the kingdom itself. The charges were grave: counterfeiting of royal authority, fraud against the crown, and aiding in treasonous activities. Each carried severe penalties, including the possibility of life imprisonment or worse. Prosecutors presented the evidence: the steel dies recovered from his workshop, the wax sticks, and the testimony of couriers who had confessed to carrying forged documents. The case seemed airtight, too airtight perhaps. Some sensed that the crown needed this conviction more than it needed the truth. The defense. The clockmaker's defense was peculiar. He did not deny making the dies. Instead, he argued that craftsmanship itself was not a crime. To carve metal was his trade. How others used those tools was beyond his control. "Would you imprison the blacksmith because a sword was used in murder?" he asked the court. It was a clever argument, one that unsettled the jurors. Yet, unlike a sword, a royal seal had no purpose other than authority. The very act of creating one, unauthorized, was itself treason. The defense strained to find witnesses to speak of his character, but fear silenced many. Neighbors who once praised him now avoided the stand, unwilling to be associated with a man branded as a traitor. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh but calculated: life imprisonment, stripped of all civil rights. Execution might have silenced him, but it risked making him a martyr to those who had relied on his forgeries. Imprisonment was safer. It demonstrated the crown's authority without the spectacle of blood. The clockmaker was led away in chains, still calm, still silent. He left behind a workshop that was dismantled, its tools seized by the state. Yet in the minds of the townspeople, he left something far less tangible: doubt. The unfinished story. What makes the case so haunting is what came after. Despite the conviction, forged seals continued to appear for years. Some bore the same hidden flourish, suggesting that copies of his dies had been distributed before his arrest. Others may have been crafted by imitators, emboldened by his example. This continuity raised troubling questions. Had the clockmaker truly been the sole artisan, or had he trained apprentices? Did he leave behind instructions, a manual of deception? Or was the network larger than investigators admitted, with multiple craftsmen scattered across borders? The state, eager to claim victory, downplayed these incidents. But merchants whispered, and officials in private correspondence admitted that the forgery crisis never fully ended. The impact on governance. The legacy of the case was profound. Governments across Europe reevaluated their reliance on wax seals. Some introduced multi-layered security measures, seals combined with signatures, paper watermarks, and embossed stamps. Others began experimenting with early mechanical numbering systems to track official documents. The age of the single wax seal as unquestioned proof was over. The clockmaker's precision had exposed a vulnerability centuries old, forcing change. In this way, he reshaped bureaucracy as surely as if he had rebuilt a clock from within. The man in his cell. Little is known of his final years. Records suggest he was held in a fortress prison, permitted limited tools for minor repairs within the walls. Some guards reported that he continued to carve, not crests but small figurines, patterns etched into wood. One account even claims he made a miniature clock from scraps of metal, its ticking echoing in the silence of his cell. Was it repentance? Or was it simply the continuation of a mind that could not rest without shaping detail? The archives fall silent after that, leaving only speculation. Reflection, crime without violence. What makes the story endure is not bloodshed or spectacle, but its quietness. No gun was fired, no bank robbed. Instead, a craftsman with steady hands shook governments by exploiting trust itself. You may wonder, as many historians do, was he truly a criminal mastermind, or merely a man whose talents were co-opted by shadowy figures? Did he profit, or was he a pawn discarded once exposed? The silence of his imprisonment denies us those answers. But the lesson lingers. Power, no matter how grand, rests on small symbols: a crest, a signature, a mark in wax. And sometimes it takes only one patient artisan to show how fragile that power can be. Closing thought. When you next see an official seal, a stamped emblem, or even a modern digital certificate, remember the man hunched over his workbench in a cobblestone town. His crime was not violence but precision. His rebellion was not loud but quiet, tick by tick, like the hands of a clock. And the question remains, how many systems today, built on trust, could be undone by one person with the right tools and enough patience? White heavy checkmark story 1 is complete. Would you like me to move on to story 2? The librarian who sold stolen manuscripts, section 1, 502,000 words. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. All right, let's begin the second crime story in our series. Here is story 2. The librarian who sold stolen manuscripts, section 502,000 words. Story 2. The librarian who sold stolen manuscripts. Section 1. Dust, silence, and missing pages. You find yourself in the hushed halls of an old university library, where the air is heavy with the smell of dust and vellum. The lamps cast yellow pools of light across long tables, and the silence is broken only by the occasional shuffle of paper. Here, in this sanctum of knowledge, theft did not come in the form of smashed glass or broken locks. It came quietly, page by page, carried away under the coat of a trusted guardian, the librarian himself. A keeper of knowledge. The librarian at the center of this story was a man known for meticulous care. His name was whispered differently across sources, Karl Reinhardt in some, Charles Renard in others. Like the clockmaker before him, he remains partly obscured by history. But what is certain is that he was entrusted with one of the most valuable collections of manuscripts in Central Europe during the late 19th century. These were no ordinary books. They were illuminated codices, medieval charters, hand-bound manuscripts from monasteries, even fragments of parchment bearing seals from kings. To scholars, they were priceless. To collectors, they were commodities. And where there is demand, there will always be supply, even if it comes through betrayal. The hunger for manuscripts. By the 1800s, Europe had developed a feverish appetite for ancient texts. Wealthy collectors in Paris, London, and Vienna competed to own original manuscripts. Auction houses did brisk trade, and dealers often looked the other way when provenance was uncertain. A single medieval codex could sell for more than a townhouse. This demand put librarians in a precarious position. They were custodians of treasures, yet their salaries were meager. They lived surrounded by wealth they could never touch. For some, temptation was overwhelming. And so it was with the librarian of this tale. He did not simply guard the manuscripts. He began to see them as a hidden currency, waiting to be converted into gold. The first missing text. The thefts began almost invisibly. A minor chronicle, rarely consulted, vanished from the catalog. Staff assumed it had been misplaced, shelved in the wrong section. Months later, a scholar searching for a medieval prayer book reported that the manuscript was missing. Again, excuses were made. Perhaps it had been loaned, perhaps misfiled. But then, copies of these very manuscripts began to appear in the catalogs of private collections abroad. A scholar in Vienna recognized one, a charter he had studied years before, now listed for auction in London. The coincidence was too great. Whispers turned into suspicion. Someone inside the library was feeding the trade. A librarian above suspicion. Ironically, the librarian himself was one of the first to express outrage. He spoke of the shame of losing treasures, of the sacred duty of preservation. His colleagues trusted him, even admired his devotion. He worked long hours, rarely taking leave. Few suspected that his very diligence gave him the perfect cover. At night, when the library was empty, he lingered in the stacks. He had the keys, the access, the authority to handle manuscripts. One by one, he selected volumes, concealed them under his coat, and carried them away. Unlike crude thieves, he was selective. He chose works whose absence would not be noticed immediately, duplicates, obscure fragments, manuscripts catalogued but rarely requested. His crime was not driven by rash greed but by careful calculation. The shadow market. Once out of the library, the manuscripts entered a shadow market. Dealers in antiquities, operating in the gray areas of legality, accepted the texts with few questions. From there, they passed into the hands of wealthy collectors. Some were rebound, stripped of identifying marks. Others were smuggled across borders under false declarations. For the librarian, the profit was life-changing. A single sale equaled several years of his salary. He lived modestly, careful not to draw attention, but small signs betrayed him. New clothes, discreet investments, occasional trips abroad. Scholars sound the alarm. What finally drew serious attention was not the loss itself, but the pattern. Scholars began publishing papers on the increasing number of manuscripts surfacing in private collections. Some noted familiar marginalia, unique scribal errors, or bindings they recognized from university catalogs. Slowly, the realization spread. Someone was bleeding libraries of their treasures. The press caught wind of it, turning the story into a minor scandal. Manuscripts vanish from state collections, one headline declared. Suddenly, the matter could not be ignored. The Ministry of Culture launched an inquiry, assigning inspectors to audit holdings. The audit. The audit was painstaking. Librarians across Europe were ordered to compare catalogs with actual holdings. It was during this process that the scale of the thefts became undeniable. Dozens of manuscripts were missing. Some had been gone for years, their absence never reported. When investigators turned to the university library at the center of our story, the discrepancies were glaring. Charters listed in the catalog could not be found. Volumes recorded in loans had no trace of return. And yet, the records showed no signs of forced entry or mishandling. The theft had to be internal. Suspicion narrows. Investigators interviewed staff. Many were junior clerks, poorly paid and with limited access. Only one man had unrestricted authority, the keys to every chamber, the trust of every superior, the head librarian himself. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Officials needed proof. They began monitoring auctions, sending agents to track sales. Soon, the trail emerged, manuscripts from the library appearing under aliases, passed through dealers known to the librarian. His name never appeared, but the connections were too close to ignore. The first confrontation. When authorities finally confronted him, he maintained composure. He denied involvement, insisting the library had been victimized by smugglers or unscrupulous clerks. His tone was measured, his indignation convincing. Some inspectors even doubted their case. But then came the crucial piece of evidence, a manuscript traced directly from the library to a dealer in Paris. The dealer admitted, under questioning, that it had been supplied by a scholar librarian who wished to remain anonymous. The description matched him precisely. The net was tightening, though he still clung to denial. An unresolved tension. At this point in the story, we are left with a moment of tension. The librarian remained in his position, still surrounded by manuscripts, still with keys jangling at his side. Investigators watched, but had not yet arrested him. The question lingered. How much longer could he balance on the edge, betraying his duty while projecting loyalty? And more haunting still, how many manuscripts had already vanished into private collections, never to return? Would you like to continue to section 2 of story 2? You said, continue. ChatGPT said. Here is story 2. The librarian who sold stolen manuscripts, section 2, 502,000 words. Story 2. The librarian who sold stolen manuscripts. Section 2. The net around the librarian. The quiet betrayal of a guardian of knowledge had now become too glaring to ignore. In the long wooden corridors of the university library, inspectors whispered among themselves, piecing together fragments of evidence. And yet, the man at the center of it, the librarian, moved calmly through his duties, polishing the reading lamps, guiding students to manuscripts, speaking with the measured tone of a custodian who appeared above suspicion. It was this duality that gave the investigation both its urgency and its danger. For the theft was not simply of paper, parchment, or leather-bound volumes. It was theft of history itself, stolen by the very man sworn to protect it. The shadow of missing text. By 1880, the scope of the thefts had become staggering. Entire codices had disappeared, sometimes replaced with crude forgeries, blank bindings filled with worthless paper to keep the shelves looking full. Scholars, when pulling such volumes, reported their horror. Covers bearing centuries of dust opened only to reveal emptiness. The loss was not only material. Every missing manuscript represented silenced voices of monks, chroniclers, and poets who had written centuries earlier. Whole genealogies, forgotten treaties, and accounts of daily life vanished into the hands of private collectors, many of whom never allowed the works to be seen again. Investigators grow restless. The ministry's investigators, though bureaucrats by training, soon took on the posture of detectives. They compared catalog entries to auction listings, traced bindings through dealers, and consulted scholars who recognized unique handwriting. Again and again, the trail circled back to one man, the librarian. His salary was modest, yet he traveled to Paris and Vienna. His suits were tailored, his gloves finer than his colleagues could afford. Most damning of all, the very manuscripts missing from his catalog appeared abroad within months, their journey too swift to be coincidence. The challenge was proving it. Surveillance in the stacks. Officials decided to watch him quietly. Agents posed as students, lingering in the reading rooms, taking notes not on manuscripts but on the librarian's movements. They noticed patterns. He lingered after closing, often carrying bundles. Sometimes he locked the manuscript chamber for hours, claiming to be cleaning. One night, an inspector followed him discreetly as he left the library. Beneath his cloak, the librarian carried a parcel. He delivered it to a carriage waiting at the far end of the square. The inspector could not see what the parcel contained, but the suspicion grew nearly to certainty. Still, without opening that parcel, the evidence remained circumstantial. The breakthrough in Paris. The breakthrough came not in the library but in Paris. A dealer, pressed under threat of losing his license, confessed that a steady supply of manuscripts came from a librarian who wore spectacles, who spoke with authority. He produced a letter of agreement, unsigned but written in a distinctive hand. When compared to the librarian's annotations in university catalogs, the handwriting was identical. With this, investigators finally had the tangible link. Proof that the head librarian was selling manuscripts abroad under cover of scholarly correspondence. The arrest. The arrest was staged carefully. Authorities feared that if confronted abruptly, he might destroy or conceal evidence. One morning, as he entered the library carrying his keys, two inspectors approached him quietly, requesting he accompany them. Witnesses later recalled how calm he appeared, as though expecting the moment all along. In his quarters, a search revealed incriminating evidence. Hidden beneath floorboards were several manuscripts wrapped in linen, awaiting shipment. Each bore the university's catalog marks. There was no longer any doubt. The interrogation. Interrogators pressed him for answers. Why had he done it? For whom had he stolen? How many manuscripts were gone? His replies were chilling in their detachment. He admitted selling manuscripts but framed it as rescuing them. Better that they live in the hands of collectors who value them than rot unread on dusty shelves, he said. He spoke of inadequate salaries, of institutions that neglected preservation. To him, the theft was not betrayal but redistribution. When asked about the number of manuscripts missing, he refused to say. "You would not wish to know," he murmured cryptically. Scholars react. The academic world was horrified. Universities across Europe debated the scandal in hushed tones. How could a man entrusted with knowledge have betrayed it? Scholars published angry essays denouncing both the librarian and the system that allowed such thefts to go unnoticed for years. Some admitted a darker truth. Without the thefts, many manuscripts might never have resurfaced. Collectors who purchased them often preserved them more carefully than the institutions they were stolen from. The irony was bitter, a crime that both robbed and preserved history at the same time. The trial. The trial began under immense public scrutiny. Journalists filled the courtroom, eager to report on the betrayal of a scholar. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: the hidden manuscripts, the dealer's confession, the handwriting comparison. Witnesses testified to his unexplained wealth, his late-night movements, his dealings with foreign collectors. The defense argued that he was not a thief but a misunderstood scholar, one who sought to protect neglected treasures. They painted him as a man trapped between duty and survival, poorly paid, unappreciated, tempted by a market that valued manuscripts more than his own employers did. But sentiment could not erase fact. The proof was overwhelming. The verdict approaches. As weeks passed, the trial drew toward its conclusion. The librarian, though convicted in the court of public opinion, remained defiant. He showed no shame, only a quiet pride, as if certain that history would vindicate him. The prosecutors, however, pressed for a heavy sentence. To them, this was no mere theft of objects but an attack on heritage itself. They argued that every missing manuscript was an irreplaceable piece of the nation's soul. The courtroom hushed as the judge prepared to pronounce sentence, the weight of centuries of stolen knowledge pressing on every ear. An unresolved pause. And here we leave the moment suspended. The gavel has not yet struck. The sentence is poised but not yet delivered. The librarian stands at the threshold of disgrace and punishment, his life's work, or betrayal, about to be judged. But the lingering question remains. Even if justice is done, how many manuscripts have vanished forever, sealed in the vaults of private collectors, their knowledge lost to the public for all time? Would you like to continue to Section 3 of Story 2? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is Story 2. The Librarian Who Sold Stolen Manuscripts, Section 3, 502,000 words. Story 2. The Librarian Who Sold Stolen Manuscripts. Section 3. Judgment, Aftermath, and the Vanishing Nala. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing. Outside, carriages clattered on cobblestones, while inside the air was heavy with anticipation. The trial of the librarian had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a moral reckoning. The theft of manuscripts was no longer a private scandal within the university. It had become a public drama about trust, heritage, and betrayal by one of the very people entrusted with safeguarding history. The sentence. When the gavel finally struck, the judge delivered a verdict of guilty on all counts of theft, fraud, and abuse of office. The sentence was stern: 20 years of imprisonment, loss of position, and confiscation of any wealth proven to be derived from the sales. The courtroom murmured at the severity. Some had expected a lighter punishment, citing his previously impeccable reputation. But the judge declared that this crime was not merely theft of goods, but theft of memory, an assault upon the continuity of culture itself. The librarian, standing silently, showed no outward reaction. He neither protested nor begged. He only adjusted his spectacles, as though preparing to resume a lecture, and looked past the crowd with a strange calm. The auction trail. In the months following the trial, investigators scrambled to recover the stolen manuscripts. Circulars were issued to collectors and dealers, demanding the return of works traced to the library. Some responded reluctantly, handing back manuscripts to avoid association with scandal. Others claimed ignorance, insisting they had purchased the works in good faith. Yet many pieces had already vanished into private collections across Europe and America. Some were rebound, stripped of catalog marks, and became indistinguishable from other volumes. Scholars began to speak of a lost generation of manuscripts, works that had been part of public institutions, now forever hidden in private vaults. Ironically, a handful resurfaced decades later, sold again at auction. But by then, the trail to their origin had been obscured. The damage was permanent. Prison years. The librarian's years in prison remain shrouded in fragments. Records note that he worked in the prison's scriptorium, repairing damaged books for the warden's office. Guards remarked on his diligence, his quiet demeanor, and his continued love for parchment and ink. Some even said he spoke wistfully of the manuscripts he had handled, as though unable to separate guilt from nostalgia. One visitor recorded his words, "They call me thief, yet I am the only one who truly valued them. I gave them to those who cherished them, when the institution let them rot in dust." This rationalization echoed throughout his confinement, leaving an unresolved ambiguity. Was he a villain who betrayed his trust, or a man who convinced himself he had done what the system failed to do? Scholars' division. The academic world remained divided. Many scholars condemned him without hesitation. They argued that no justification could excuse the betrayal of a public trust. To them, his actions represented the arrogance of a man who placed personal gain above the common good. Others, however, offered a reluctant acknowledgement of complexity. They pointed out that many institutions of the era were indeed negligent, leaving manuscripts to decay in damp vaults. Some works he sold were preserved more carefully by collectors than they ever had been in libraries. In this way, his crime blurred the line between theft and preservation. Yet even those who admitted this paradox concluded the same. The decision was not his to make. His crime was not only the act of theft, but the presumption of ownership over the cultural memory of a nation. Legacy of distrust. The consequences for libraries were profound. Across Europe, institutions tightened their systems. New cataloging procedures were introduced, requiring multiple staff members to sign off on access to rare manuscripts. Seals were affixed not only to shelves but to individual bindings. Loans were restricted, and special reading rooms were established with constant supervision. The scandal shifted the way institutions viewed custodianship. Trust, once unquestioned, was now tempered with oversight. The librarian's betrayal had forced a transformation in how libraries safeguarded their most precious holdings. A man forgotten. When his sentence was finally completed, the librarian emerged into a world that had already moved past him. He lived the rest of his years in obscurity, shunned by colleagues, his name erased from the university's rolls. Some say he returned to a small village, living quietly, still surrounded by books. Others suggest he continued to trade manuscripts in secret, though no proof exists. His death passed without public notice. No obituary marked the end of his life. His story, however, lingered in the margins of archives, told by scholars and librarians as a cautionary tale. Reflection: the theft of memory. What makes this story endure is not its drama but its subtle violence. No blood was spilled. No crowds were terrified. Yet the wound inflicted was deeper than many crimes of force. It was the theft of knowledge, the erasure of collective memory. You, as the listener, are left to consider the paradox. Was he merely a thief, driven by greed? Or was he a misguided guardian, who convinced himself that private hands valued manuscripts more than public institutions ever could? Did he betray history, or did he expose how fragile our systems of preservation truly are? The uncomfortable truth is that both may be correct. And so his story becomes less about one man, and more about the perennial tension between public trust and private desire, between preservation and possession. Closing thought. The next time you enter a library and see manuscripts resting quietly behind glass, remember the librarian who carried them under his coat into the night. His crime reminds us that the greatest betrayals are not always violent. Sometimes they are quiet, methodical, and hidden beneath the very silence of the stacks. And one question lingers. How many manuscripts in today's collections still bear invisible scars of theft, lost and recovered, their histories rewritten by hands that were never meant to touch them? White Heavy Checkmark Story 2 is complete. Would you like me to move on to Story 3? The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings, Section 1, 502,000 words. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Understood, let's continue with the next crime story. Here is Story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings, Section 1, 502,000 words. Story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings. Section 1. A pill for every illness. You step into a small European town at the turn of the 20th century. Cobblestone streets wind past bakeries, workshops, and modest homes with shutters drawn tight against the evening chill. At the center of the town's trust stood the figure of the physician. He was the man families called when fever struck, when childbirth became dangerous, when coughs lingered too long. His word carried weight, his prescriptions authority. Yet in this particular town, the trust placed in a doctor was slowly, almost invisibly, turned into a weapon. The doctor of quiet reputation. The doctor was not flamboyant. He did not seek notoriety through grand discoveries or publications in medical journals. Instead, he built his reputation on availability. He was always there, whether summoned late at night or for the smallest of ailments. His name, recorded in fragments as Dr. Friedrich Bauer in one source, Frederick Bohr in another, carried reassurance. Mothers trusted him with their infants, old men with their fatting strength, and merchants with their aches from long days of labor. This was the very foundation of his eventual crime, the total, unquestioned trust of his community. Medicine in an age of mystery. At the time, medicine was still an uncertain science. Doctors prescribed mixtures of powders and tinctures, often with little understanding of how they worked. Some medicines soothed symptoms but offered no cure. Others, like morphine or arsenic compounds, carried risks but were widely used. Patients rarely questioned their doctors. To them, the little bottles with handwritten labels were mysterious lifelines. This uncertainty gave physicians both power and freedom. A prescription could heal or harm, and few laypeople would ever know the difference. The first suspicions. The story began with a widow who sought treatment for stomach pain. The doctor prescribed a tonic, and within days she was dead. At the time, such outcomes were not unusual. Illness was common, remedies uncertain. But whispers began when another patient, a young shopkeeper, died weeks later after receiving a similar tonic. His death was recorded as sudden gastric failure. When a third case followed, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in good health until visiting the doctor, the coincidences grew difficult to ignore. Relatives noticed that all three had been in possession of the doctor's small bottles, each bearing his careful handwriting. Still, suspicion remained muted. To accuse a doctor of poisoning patients was almost unthinkable. The doctor's persona. Outwardly, the doctor showed no sign of guilt. He continued his practice, visiting homes, offering reassurance, attending funerals with the appropriate solemnity. His demeanor was calm, detached, but caring enough to seem trustworthy. If he felt satisfaction, he did not display it. If he profited from these deaths, it was subtle. Some said he waived fees for poorer patients, which made him seem all the more generous. Yet others noticed that his wealth grew quietly, small investments here, a larger home than his income might suggest. It was as if he moved through life under two masks, the healer in public and something darker in private. A community grows uneasy. As deaths accumulated, unease spread. Families whispered in kitchens, merchants gossiped over ale. Why were so many of his patients dying suddenly? Some suggested he was simply unlucky, assigned to cases too advanced to treat. Others claimed he possessed a coldness, a detachment that made him unsuited to care. Finally, a group of townspeople brought their concerns to the local magistrate. They did not accuse directly, but they asked for clarification. Was it possible the doctor's remedies contained errors? Could his mixtures be examined? The magistrate, reluctant to undermine the town's trust in its only physician, hesitated. But he quietly ordered the next suspicious death to be investigated. The telltale powder. That investigation came sooner than expected. An elderly widow died after a brief illness under the doctor's care. Her family, distrustful, preserved the tonic bottle he had left. When examined by a chemist, the powder inside revealed traces of arsenic, far beyond any therapeutic dose. The finding was explosive. Arsenic was known as a common poison, but it was also used in small amounts in some treatments. For the first time, there was tangible evidence that the doctor's hand had crossed the line between healer and killer. Investigators close in. The magistrate ordered quiet surveillance. Patients' bottles were collected, and several revealed suspicious substances. Records showed that many of the deceased had left modest inheritances, often after consulting the doctor. In some cases, he had been named executor or advisor to the families. The pattern grew undeniable. He was not simply careless, he was deliberate. His medical authority allowed him to dispense poison masked as treatment, and few questioned him until it was too late. The question of motive. Yet one mystery remained. Why? The deaths did not always yield him financial gain. Some victims left him nothing. Others were not rivals or enemies. His motives seemed inconsistent, almost random. Scholars who later studied the case speculated. Was he driven by greed, seeking inheritance when opportunity arose? Or was it a darker curiosity, the thrill of holding life and death in his hands? Some even suggested a pathological desire to test poisons under the cloak of medical legitimacy. Whatever the motive, his crimes blurred the boundary between healer and predator, leaving his community trapped in doubt. A town in fear. By the late 1890s, fear gripped the town. Families hesitated to summon the doctor, even when ill. Some sought cures from apothecaries or folk healers instead. The very figure once seen as protector now cast a shadow of suspicion over every doorstep. And yet, the magistrate still hesitated to arrest him. The evidence, though mounting, was not complete. To accuse a doctor was to risk destabilizing the community's fragile trust in medicine itself. So the investigation continued quietly, waiting for the one case that would break the silence forever. An unanswered moment. And here, we leave the story at its most fragile point. A town paralyzed between trust and terror, a doctor walking freely with vials in his pockets, and investigators holding fragments of proof but not yet the whole truth. The haunting question remains: how many more patients would need to die before the quiet poisonings were brought fully into the light? Would you like me to continue to section 2 of story 3? You said, continue. ChatGPT said. Here is story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings, section 2, 502,000 words. Story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings. Section 2. Unmasking the Healer. The town had lived too long under a shadow. Whispers that once stayed in kitchens now spilled into the marketplace, where merchants lowered their voices as the doctor passed. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked the square. He was still addressed with courtesy, Herr Doctor, but behind every greeting was suspicion. The townspeople could not reconcile the contradiction. The man meant to heal them might also be the one who quietly hastened death. The magistrate's dilemma. For the magistrate charged with investigating, the case was delicate. To accuse the town's only physician without undeniable proof would cause panic, yet waiting risked more deaths. He consulted chemists, gathering analyses of powders and tinctures. Some contained elevated levels of arsenic or morphine, amounts that could not be explained away as error. But still, the magistrate hesitated. Courts demanded certainty. His solution was to assemble a covert task. A small circle of clerks and apothecaries tasked with shadowing the doctor, cataloging every prescription, and gathering testimonies from bereaved families. Quietly, methodically, they built a ledger of suspicion. Patterns emerged. The ledger revealed chilling consistencies. Many of the doctor's patients died within days of treatment. Most deaths were attributed to gastric distress or sudden heart failure. Several victims, though, had not been seriously ill before his visit. A deeper pattern was financial. Records showed that the doctor often positioned himself near estates at risk of dispute. In some cases, he became a trusted advisor to childless widows. In others, he received modest bequests after deaths. These inheritances were never grand, but added together they provided him a comfortable lifestyle far beyond his official income. It was enough to suggest motive, though investigators sensed something deeper. A psychological satisfaction, perhaps, in holding such unchecked power. The widow's testimony. One turning point came from the testimony of a widow whose husband had survived the doctor's treatment. The man had been prescribed a powder for stomach agitation. After taking a single dose, he collapsed, but survived thanks to the intervention of another physician from a neighboring town. That physician declared the powder lethal in composition. The widow kept the bottle, and when investigators examined it, they found concentrations of arsenic unmistakable to any chemist. At last, they had not only suspicion, but living testimony of survival against the doctor's hand. A divided town. Despite mounting evidence, the town itself was divided. Some villagers refused to believe their trusted physician could be guilty. They argued he was the victim of envy or rumor, that his unusual prescriptions were simply misunderstood innovations. Others grew angry, convinced that the authorities were stalling. Funerals multiplied, and each coffin carried the weight of unanswered questions. The doctor, meanwhile, continued his rounds, seemingly unfazed by the growing tension. He visited patients, attended services, and even offered condolences at funerals of those he himself had likely poisoned. His calmness unsettled many, yet made others doubt he could truly be guilty. The autopsies begin. Under pressure, the magistrate authorized exhumations. Bodies of recent patients were unearthed and examined by medical experts. The results were damning. Several showed unmistakable traces of arsenic and morphine in concentrations incompatible with therapeutic use. The news, though initially kept quiet, leaked quickly. Soon the town knew that the graves themselves were testifying. Each body became evidence, each autopsy a page in the story of betrayal. The magistrate could delay no longer. An arrest was planned. The arrest. On a cool autumn morning, as the doctor returned from a house call, officers approached him outside his home. Witnesses later recalled how composed he remained. He handed over his medical bag without protest, calmly remarking, "You will find only what I chose for you to find." Inside the bag, investigators discovered several vials labeled with patients' names. Chemical analysis revealed dangerously high levels of poisons. It was the final confirmation. The healer was indeed the killer. Interrogation. In custody, the doctor spoke sparingly. When asked about the powders, he claimed they were standard remedies misused by patients. When confronted with autopsy results, he shrugged, suggesting that illness itself had produced the symptoms. But on one occasion, he made a remark that chilled the interrogators. "I alone decide the measure of suffering. Who are you to question the physician's judgment?" It was neither a confession nor a denial, but something more disturbing, a glimpse into a mind that saw medical authority as absolute power. The courtroom drama. The trial drew enormous attention. Citizens crowded the gallery, desperate to hear whether their fears would be confirmed. Witnesses testified. grieving families, chemists presenting analyses, the widow whose husband had survived. The most damning testimony came from the exhumations, each case piling weight upon the jury's conscience. The defense argued that the medicines were within accepted ranges of treatment, that outcomes varied, and that death was often inevitable in an age of limited medical knowledge. They painted the doctor as a scapegoat for the community's fear of mortality. But the evidence spoke louder. Too many deaths clustered around his hand, too many vials contained lethal concentrations. The sentence approaches. As weeks passed, the case became less about one doctor and more about the fragility of trust. If a physician could be a poisoner, then what safety remained? The court knew it must send a message. The prosecutor demanded death by guillotine or hanging, depending on jurisdiction. The defense begged for leniency, citing lack of direct confession. The townspeople whispered, divided between outrage and disbelief. On the eve of the verdict, the doctor sat in his cell, writing in a small notebook. Its contents were never fully revealed, but fragments suggest he wrote not of guilt or regret, but of the art of dosage, the line between healing and release. A question left hanging. As the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, the town held its breath. Would he be condemned to die, or would the ambiguity of his profession spare him? The gavel had not yet fallen, and still the question remained. Was this man a murderer disguised as a healer, or a physician whose ambition for control blurred into pathology? And so we pause at the edge of judgment, where truth and doubt stand uneasily side by side. Would you like me to continue to Section 3 of Story 3? You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, "Here is Story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings, Section 3, 1, 502,000 words. Story 3. The Town Doctor's Quiet Poisonings. Section 3. Judgment, Consequences, and the Poison Legacy." The courtroom fell silent as the judge raised his hand. Everyone in the gallery leaned forward, merchants, grieving families, and even patients who had once trusted the man now standing in chains. The verdict would not only decide his fate, it would answer a question that haunted the entire community. Could the man they once called healer truly have been the agent of so much death? The verdict. The sentence was delivered with gravity. The doctor was declared guilty of multiple counts of murder by poisoning, fraud in medical practice, and abuse of trust. The judge's words cut through the silence. "You who were called to heal have chosen instead to destroy. Your hand, entrusted with life, has trafficked in death. For this betrayal you shall answer with your own." The punishment was execution, a rare but deliberate judgment meant to restore the public's shaken faith in medicine. The gallery erupted. Some gasped in relief, others sobbed quietly, and a few whispered that justice had at last been done. The final days. Awaiting his execution, the doctor remained curiously composed. In prison, he wrote letters, though most were confiscated. One, smuggled out, allegedly read, "I do not kill, I release. I do not betray, I decide. Is that not the physician's highest calling?" Guards noted he remained meticulous, arranging his cell as if it were a clinic, keeping his few belongings in neat rows. He asked for no priest, sought no forgiveness. To the end, he seemed convinced of his own authority, as though judgment by society could not outweigh the authority of his own hand. When the day came, he walked calmly to the scaffold, his eyes scanning the crowd without visible fear. Witnesses later recalled that he muttered one final phrase, "They all trusted me." The town afterward. The execution did not end the unease. For years, townspeople continued to recount their suspicions, remembering relatives who had died suddenly under his care. Some wondered aloud if the true number of his victims had ever been revealed. Was it dozens? Scores? Perhaps more? The graves that could not be exhumed remained silent witnesses, forever withholding their testimony. Families struggled with conflicting emotions. Some felt relief that justice had been done. Others felt shame that they had once defended him, allowing deaths to continue. And many lived with lingering fear. Could another physician ever be trusted so completely again? The wider impact. The scandal spread far beyond the town. Newspapers across Europe published lurid accounts of the Doctor of Death. Medical journals, though reluctant to admit such betrayal within their profession, began quietly urging reforms. Guidelines on toxic substances tightened. Apothecaries were instructed to record every sale of arsenic, morphine, and other poisons. Physicians faced stricter oversight, no longer permitted to dispense unchecked remedies without record. In this way, the crimes of one man reshaped the medical profession. Trust could not be blind anymore. It needed verification. Scholars' interpretations. Historians who studied the case later debated his motives. Was he driven by financial gain, targeting those whose estates might yield him profit? Some evidence supported this, yet not all his victims left him money. Others argued he was a sadist, deriving pleasure from secret control over life and death. Still others saw him as a pathological experimenter, fascinated by the line between dose and death. The ambiguity has never been resolved. His silence in confession left scholars with only speculation. But perhaps the uncertainty itself is the most unsettling truth, that some crimes defy clear motives, born instead from the darker recesses of human nature. Reflection, the fragile bond of trust. The story of the town doctor reminds us of something deeply uncomfortable. The bond between patient and physician rests entirely on trust. You accept the pill, the injection, the prescription, because you believe in the intention behind it. Strip that intention away, and medicine becomes indistinguishable from poison. The doctor's crimes did not merely kill individuals. They shattered the very fabric of a community's faith in care itself. His legacy is not only the deaths he caused, but the suspicion he left behind, a suspicion that lingered in every whispered question. How do we know? Closing thought. When you next sit in a waiting room when you accept a prescription handed across a counter, remember the story of the town doctor. He shows us that crime does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the form of a tonic bottle, a powder folded into paper, a calm voice assuring you of healing. And the question lingers still: how many crimes, cloaked in authority and trust, pass unrecognized until it is far too late? White heavy checkmark. Story 3 is complete. Would you like me to move on to Story 4? The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters, Section 1, 502,000 words. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is Story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters, Section 1, 502,000 words. Story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters. Section 1. A town cut off from its own words. The mail coach rattled over dirt roads, carrying more than parcels and papers. It carried the pulse of connection. In the 19th century, letters were lifelines. They brought news of births and deaths, instructions for trade, confessions of love, and decisions that changed livelihoods. A postmaster, then, was not just a bureaucrat. He was the trusted guardian of voices traveling across distance. But in one small town, that trust was slowly corroded. The townspeople began to notice gaps: letters delayed, parcels gone missing, replies never arriving. At first it was dismissed as misfortune. Soon, however, the pattern revealed itself. The crime was not in the roads or the weather. The crime was in the very man who stood behind the counter of the post office. The central figure. The postmaster was known to all. He had a round face, spectacles perched low, and a habit of recording every parcel with meticulous precision. His name appears variously as Anton Mueller or Anton Mahler in different reports, suggesting a man whose reputation stretched across borders. He had been appointed decades earlier and had earned, or at least projected, the image of reliability. But trust can mask opportunity. With no oversight beyond occasional audits, The postmaster held in his hands the town's most intimate communications. He could see who was writing to whom, who awaited money, who whispered secrets in folded sheets. And it was here that temptation took root. Letters as currency. To understand the magnitude of his betrayal, you must imagine the era. There were no telephones in most homes, no electronic transfers. A letter containing a money order might represent a family's entire savings. A sealed envelope might carry business contracts or the instructions for a sale of land. Even personal correspondence could hold power, gossip, confessions, or scandals that, if revealed, could ruin reputations. In his role, the postmaster had access to all of this, and he began to exploit it. Some letters never left his office. Some money orders were cashed fraudulently. Some private confessions were quietly read before being destroyed. The theft was not of paper alone, but of trust, privacy, and futures. The first whispers of doubt. The townspeople first grew suspicious when a merchant complained that an expected payment from a trading partner never arrived. The partner insisted he had sent it weeks earlier, sealed and recorded. Soon after, a widow claimed her son's letters from the army had ceased, though he swore he was still writing regularly. One by one, others reported similar stories: lost letters, vanished parcels, silences that could not be explained. At first, the blame fell on the roads. Mail coaches were attacked by bandits, whether often delayed deliveries. But the sheer consistency of the disappearances made such excuses harder to accept. Too many letters were vanishing in the same town, under the same postmaster's care. The pattern emerges. It was not until an official audit that the scale became visible. Inspectors noted discrepancies in accounts, missing money orders, forged receipts, and letters logged as delivered that recipients swore never reached them. The handwriting on some receipts matched suspiciously with the postmaster's own. Still, he denied wrongdoing. He blamed careless clerks, errors in records, even the dishonesty of townsfolk themselves. His calm demeanor and long years of service gave him credibility. Some neighbors defended him, saying he had always been kind, always reliable. But the pattern deepened. When certain families expected inheritances or payments, the letters invariably disappeared. When rival merchants received correspondence about contracts, the papers went missing, only for the postmaster's acquaintances to gain the advantage. It became increasingly clear that the thefts were deliberate. The human cost. The true crime was not just theft of money. It was the theft of human connection. A mother grieved when she believed her son at the front had stopped writing. A merchant lost trade because his letters of credit never arrived. Lovers drifted apart, convinced of silence where words had been intercepted. The town, cut off from its own communications, began to feel isolated not by distance, but by betrayal. The postmaster's crime was quiet, invisible, and devastating. Each undelivered letter became a fracture in the fabric of trust. The breaking point. The case reached its turning point when a letter containing legal documents for a land sale vanished. The buyer insisted he had sent the papers by registered post. When the seller never received them, the deal collapsed. Later, the property was purchased by a friend of the postmaster. This coincidence proved too great to ignore. The Ministry of Posts sent investigators directly. They began opening mailbags before and after they passed through the town. Sure enough, discrepancies emerged. Parcels present before arrival disappeared after being logged in the postmaster's office. The evidence was now undeniable. The crime was not on the roads. It was at the very heart of the post office. An uneasy pause. And so, the town found itself standing on the edge of revelation. The man they had trusted with their words, their money, and their private lives now stood accused of betraying them all. Yet he still sat behind his counter, stamping letters with calm precision, as though nothing had changed. The question hung unspoken. How many secrets, fortunes, and lives had been altered forever by one man's quiet theft of paper? Would you like me to continue to section 2 of story 4? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters, section 2, 502,000 words. Story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters. Section 2. Secrets in the Mailbag. The town had grown weary of excuses. Each vanished letter was not just an inconvenience, it was a wound. Families were torn apart by misunderstandings, merchants ruined by missed opportunities, and soldiers, mothers haunted by silence where words should have been. Yet the postmaster, seated each morning behind his counter, continued his quiet routine, weighing envelopes, stamping dates, recording parcels with steady hands. He looked every inch the servant of the crown. But beneath that steady mask lay years of betrayal. Investigators at work. The Ministry of Posts, spurred by mounting complaints, placed 2 inspectors in the town under cover. They posed as traveling merchants who sent and received frequent correspondence. Their letters, filled with coded phrases, were designed to test the system. Out of 20 sent through the post office, 6 never arrived at their destination. When traced, each had vanished only after passing through the postmaster's hands. The inspectors grew convinced. This was not negligence or accident. It was deliberate interception. The postmaster had grown so confident in his position that he tampered with mail openly, assuming no one would dare accuse him. The reading of letters. When authorities searched the office, they discovered a locked drawer beneath the counter. Inside were not just stolen money orders and contracts, but bundles of personal letters, opened, read, and resealed poorly. Here was the most unsettling truth. The postmaster had not merely stolen valuables. He had pried into private lives. Among the letters were confessions of love, quarrels between families, political discussions, even disputes between businessmen. Some were missing only a page, suggesting he had taken information while allowing the rest to continue. Others were destroyed entirely, their words lost forever. To investigators, the motive now seemed larger than money. He had positioned himself as the silent listener of the town's most intimate communications. In a sense, he was the town's unseen confessor, collecting secrets not for redemption but for exploitation. Motives untangled. Why had he done it? Money explained part of it. He cashed forged orders, took inheritances, and used information to tilt business in favor of friends. Yet, interviews with townsfolk hinted at something more, a hunger for control. The postmaster was not wealthy, nor did he live extravagantly, but he enjoyed influence. He knew which families quarreled, which merchants faced ruin, which soldiers wrote faithfully, and which had ceased. This knowledge made him powerful. He was, in effect, the town's invisible puppeteer. The town reacts. When the revelations emerged, the shock was profound. To learn that their confidences, their contracts, their intimate words had passed through his prying eyes was unbearable. Some refused to believe it, insisting there must be mistake. Others erupted in anger. Crowds gathered outside the post office, shouting that he had betrayed them all. The irony was sharp. The man once trusted with delivering messages now became the subject of whispered conversations and pointed fingers. People no longer sent letters without fear. Some even began traveling miles to the next town to post their mail. Trust in the very institution of correspondence had fractured. The arrest. Authorities moved quickly to prevent unrest. Early one morning, officers entered the post office under the guise of routine inspection. When the postmaster opened his drawer, they demanded the key. Inside lay the incriminating letters, the forged receipts, and several money orders already altered. Witnesses reported that he did not struggle. Instead, he sighed, as though relieved that the pretense was finally over. His only words were, "You'll never trace all of them." It was less confession than declaration, an acknowledgement that the scale of his thefts exceeded even what they had uncovered. The interrogation. In questioning, he remained calm. He admitted to intercepting letters but justified it as correcting errors or protecting people from harmful words. He claimed that some letters contained slander or deceit, and by stopping them he had preserved harmony. Investigators recognized this for what it was: rationalization. The money orders, the forged contracts, the destroyed correspondence told another story. When pressed on how long he had been stealing, he refused to say. Some speculated it had been decades. If so, the number of undelivered letters could be in the thousands. The trial. The trial became a spectacle. Witnesses filled the courtroom, holding receipts for letters that never arrived, recalling heartbreaks and financial losses. The widow who believed her son had forgotten her testified with tears, clutching one of his intercepted letters now returned as evidence. Merchants recounted contracts that never reached them, deals ruined by silence. The prosecution painted him as a man who weaponized trust. They argued that his crime was not only theft of property, but theft of the very bonds that connected people. The defense, however, claimed he was overwhelmed, that errors were inevitable in such a position, and that others might have exploited gaps in the system. But the drawer of stolen letters, laid out for the court, silenced most doubts. Judgment approaches. As the trial drew to a close, the jury faced a grim choice. The law provided harsh penalties for tampering with royal mail. It was considered a crime against the crown itself. But some townspeople pleaded for mercy, remembering his years of service, his role as a fixture of the community. The judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The courtroom held its breath. Would he be condemned to prison, to hard labor, perhaps even execution? Or would his years of faithful appearance soften the blow? A question left hanging. At this point, the story teeters on the brink of conclusion. The man who once controlled the flow of every letter now stood awaiting judgment, his fate uncertain. But beyond the question of his punishment lay something deeper. How many lives had been altered, permanently and invisibly, by the letters that never arrived? Was justice even possible, when the stolen words could never be returned to those who had waited in vain? Would you like me to continue to section 3 of story 4? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters, section 3, 1, 502,000 words. Story 4. The Postmaster and the Undelivered Letters. Section 3. Judgment, Consequences, and Broken Trust. The judge lifted the sentence paper, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. The verdict would not only decide the postmaster's fate, but also determine how a community could heal after years of betrayal. The courtroom, packed with townspeople, merchants, and grieving families, leaned forward as one. The verdict. The postmaster was found guilty of embezzlement, forgery, destruction of correspondence, and abuse of public trust. The law considered tampering with royal or state mail a crime against the crown itself. The judge condemned him to 15 years of imprisonment with hard labor and the forfeiture of all assets acquired during his tenure. The sentence was severe but stopped short of capital punishment. The judge explained that execution was traditionally reserved for crimes of treason or murder, but in this case, the gravity of destroying thousands of personal bonds warranted near-equivalent severity. Some citizens gasped in relief, others muttered that it was too lenient. For many, no sentence could repair the damage done. His final words in court. Before being led away, the postmaster was asked if he wished to make a statement. He stood quietly, hands bound, and said, "You all place too much faith in letters. Words are fragile. They are easily lost, burned, or stolen. I only proved what you should have known, that trust in paper is a fool's trust." His words sent a chill through the room. They were not words of regret, but of justification. To some, they sounded like philosophy. To most, they confirmed his arrogance, a man who had never seen himself as a servant but as a master of the town's lifeblood. Aftermath in the town. The prison coach carried him away, but the wounds remained. Families never received the missing letters. Lovers who had drifted apart under the weight of silence rarely found each other again. Merchants who had gone bankrupt due to lost contracts did not recover their fortunes. The harm, unlike money, could not be repaid. Even when investigators returned some seized letters to their intended recipients, years had passed. A mother opening a letter from her son discovered words written before his death in war, words she had been denied until grief had long hardened. Another man received a love letter from a woman who had since married another. The words, once alive with meaning, arrived too late. The town never forgot this injury. Trust in the post took years to rebuild, and some never used the local office again, preferring to ride long distances to neighboring towns just to send correspondence. The shadow of lost letters. Historians estimate that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of letters were destroyed by him during his career. The exact number will never be known. For every intercepted money order or contract, there were countless personal notes, promises, confessions, apologies that simply disappeared. The silences left behind shaped lives more than the words ever could. In this way, the crime was less about theft and more about erasure. He stole not only money but memories, silencing connections before they reached their destination. It is a crime so quiet it almost resists measurement, yet its impact echoes louder than most acts of violence. Institutional reforms. The scandal prompted sweeping reforms. Post offices across the country were ordered to implement stricter auditing. Keys to storage rooms could no longer be held by a single postmaster. At least 2 clerks were required for verification. Receipts were redesigned, and money orders tracked with greater rigor. Random inspections became common, ensuring no individual could hoard secrets unchecked. It was, ironically, the postmaster's betrayal that strengthened the institution. But the reforms were born of pain, paid for by the lives disrupted in one small town. The postmaster in prison. In prison, records show he labored quietly, often assigned to clerical tasks because of his neat handwriting. Some guards remarked that he remained unrepentant, occasionally boasting of how easily he had manipulated the town. One note from a prison chaplain recorded him saying, "Words are nothing unless controlled. I controlled them." He served out his sentence without ever expressing remorse. Upon release, he faded into obscurity, living out his final years far from the town he had betrayed. No obituary marked his death. To the community, his name remained a curse, spoken only as warning. Reflection, the silence between words. What lingers from this story is not the spectacle of theft, but the quiet devastation of absence. Imagine waiting for a letter that never arrives, day after day, watching the horizon for the mail coach that brings only disappointment. The harm is subtle but corrosive, built on the erosion of trust and the ache of unanswered silence. The postmaster's crime reminds us that communication itself can be fragile. When trust in its guardians collapses, so too does the sense of connection between people. His betrayal transformed not just lives, but the very meaning of correspondence in his town. Closing thought. The next time you open a letter, or even a message delivered instantly across digital networks, consider the invisible trust that underlies it. We rarely think of the hands through which our words pass. The postmaster's story warns us that sometimes the greatest betrayals are not loud or violent. They are the quiet disappearances of words meant for us, stolen before we ever knew they existed. And the haunting question remains: how many more of our words across history have been silenced before reaching their destination? White heavy checkmark story 4 is complete. Would you like me to move on to story 5? The railroad ticket forgery scandal, section 1-502-000 words. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal, Section 1 502,000 words. Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal. Section 1. Stubs and Shadows. The 19th century was the age of steam. The shriek of locomotives and the hiss of iron engines carried passengers and goods farther and faster than ever before. Railroads stitched together cities, towns, and villages, transforming entire economies. And at the heart of this system was a simple slip of paper, the railroad ticket. A ticket was more than proof of payment. It was a passport to mobility, stamped with routes, dates, and company logos. In an era before electronic validation, it was also fragile, relying entirely on the trust that paper could not easily be duplicated. That trust, however, became the weakness exploited in what came to be called the railroad ticket forgery scandal. The rise of the railroads. By the mid-1800s, Europe's railway network had expanded rapidly. Each line had its own tickets, printed with distinct colors, fonts, and perforations. Passengers purchased them at depots, and conductors punched them during travel. For most travelers, the system seemed orderly and secure. But to counterfeiters, the tickets were an irresistible target. They were small, portable, and compared to currency, far less protected. Unlike banknotes, which carried intricate engravings and watermarks, tickets were often cheaply printed. A skilled printer with access to paper and ink could replicate them convincingly. The first forgeries. Reports of forged tickets began quietly. Conductors occasionally noticed oddities, tickets printed on slightly different stock, numbers that did not match the issuing station's records, or ink colors that smudged too easily. At first, these were dismissed as clerical errors. But soon, entire groups of passengers were found traveling with false tickets. Railroad companies began to lose significant revenue. A line connecting two major cities reported a 20% drop in expected fares, even though passenger numbers remained steady. Somewhere, counterfeiters were flooding the market with forged slips of paper and profiting handsomely. The network behind the crime. Investigators discovered that the operation was far larger than a few opportunists. In one major city, police raided a print shop suspected of forgery. Inside, they found stacks of half-finished tickets, printing plates with railroad logos, and bundles of counterfeit stubs ready for distribution. The mastermind was not a common thief, but a former employee of the railway's own ticketing office. He knew the designs, the numbering system, and the weaknesses in distribution. With accomplices, printers, sellers, and even a handful of corrupt conductors, he created a shadow market for travel. Passengers purchased the forged tickets at lower prices from clandestine sellers near stations. To many, the risk was worth the savings. Few cared whether the company lost revenue. What mattered was the cheap ride. A system of trust exploited. The scandal exposed how much the railway system relied on trust. Conductors were trained to punch tickets, not scrutinize them like banknotes. Most had only seconds to examine each slip as passengers boarded. A convincing forgery could pass easily, especially during crowded journeys. The counterfeiters exploited every weakness, mimicking company logos, duplicating ticket books, and even reusing genuine ticket stubs by bleaching the ink. It became a sophisticated underground industry, so pervasive that some towns joked, "Why buy a real ticket when the forgers sell them faster?" Public reaction. When newspapers broke the story, outrage spread quickly. Citizens who had trusted the railways felt betrayed, not only by the counterfeiters but by the companies themselves. How could an industry that controlled so much wealth be so careless in securing its tickets? Letters to editors demanded reform, better printing, stricter inspection, harsher penalties. But the scandal also revealed a quieter truth. Many ordinary people had participated. To some, purchasing a forged ticket was not theft but a bargain. The scandal was as much about complicity as it was about crime. The investigators' dilemma. Authorities struggled to respond. Raiding print shops caught some counterfeiters, but the demand ensured others replaced them. The small slips of paper were easily hidden, transported, and sold. Unlike stolen goods, tickets vanished into use almost instantly. The greatest challenge was proving guilt. A passenger caught with a forged ticket could always claim ignorance, saying they had purchased it at what they thought was a legitimate outlet. Sellers rarely stayed in one place long enough to be caught. The network operated like smoke, visible in effect, but elusive in form. The human side of the crime. Behind the scandal were human stories. Struggling workers defended their purchases of cheap forged tickets as survival, not crime. Conductors feared losing their jobs if they failed to detect forgeries. Honest printers saw their reputations tarnished by suspicion. And railway clerks, overwhelmed by discrepancies in ticket accounts, faced accusations of negligence. The scandal was more than fraud. It was a mirror held up to society, showing the desperation of the poor, the greed of the counterfeiters, and the vulnerabilities of the new industrial age. The turning point. It was in 1878 that investigators uncovered the most crucial lead. A conductor, suspected of collusion, was caught with bundles of unpunched counterfeit tickets hidden in his quarters. Under interrogation, he confessed to working with a network that spanned multiple cities. He revealed names, locations of secret print shops, and details of how profits were shared. For the first time, the structure of the conspiracy became visible. This was not a local nuisance but a sprawling enterprise, organized with precision, almost like a railway of crime running parallel to the real one. The unresolved question. And so, the stage was set. The authorities had names, locations, and evidence of conspiracy. Yet the forgers remained one step ahead, their market still thriving. Could the railways ever close down such a widespread and profitable shadow industry? Or would the ticket scandal continue to ride the rails as invisibly as the trains themselves? Would you like me to continue to Section 2 of Story 5? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal, Section 2, 502,000 words. Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal. Section 2. The Machinery of Counterfeit. The investigation into the railroad ticket forgery scandal deepened with the confession of the corrupt conductor. What had begun as whispers of missing revenue had unfolded into the revelation of a criminal enterprise sprawling across multiple cities. But the closer investigators looked, the more intricate the machinery of counterfeit became. Anatomy of a forgery. Forging a railroad ticket required more than crude imitation. Investigators discovered that counterfeiters had perfected a system. They used genuine tickets as templates, dismantling them carefully to study the fonts, perforations, and numbering. In one workshop, detectives found stacks of real tickets stolen from depots, used as reference models. Printers crafted detailed plates bearing company logos. They sourced paper stock resembling the official supply and blended inks to match the shades used by the railway. Even the metallic edges of some premium tickets were imitated using foil pressed by hand. The result was so convincing that even experienced conductors struggled to spot differences. Some operations became even more creative, bleaching out the punched holes of used tickets and reprinting them with altered details. Others focused on mass-producing excursion tickets, which were less scrutinized because they were sold in bulk for events or fairs. By exploiting these blind spots, counterfeiters maximized profit while minimizing risk. Distribution networks. The sale of forged tickets was not random. Entire distribution channels had formed. Peddlers loitered near stations, offering discount fares to travelers in a hurry. Newsagents, tavern keepers, and even petty criminals became intermediaries. In some towns, Counterfeit tickets were so common that they created parallel economies. A man boarding a train in the city could buy a forged ticket at half price, travel unchallenged, and then sell his return ticket to another passenger. The paper changed hands multiple times, yielding profit at every stage. This underground market thrived precisely because it met demand. For the working class, genuine train tickets were expensive. Forged ones made travel affordable. The moral line blurred. Was it a crime to board a train on a piece of paper indistinguishable from the real thing, when the companies themselves seemed wealthy and distant? The companies strike back. Railway companies could not ignore the losses. Revenue records showed devastating shortfalls. Some lines reported deficits so large they feared insolvency. Public confidence wavered. If passengers could not trust the ticket system, what else about the railways was vulnerable? The companies introduced new measures. Tickets began to carry watermarks, unique numbering sequences, and occasionally embossed seals. Conductors were retrained to examine tickets more closely, and random spot checks were introduced at major stations. But these reforms came at a cost. Passengers now endured longer waits at checkpoints. Conductors faced greater workloads and mistakes increased. Meanwhile, counterfeiters adapted quickly, altering their methods to mimic the new designs. The arms race between forger and railway had begun. Law enforcement steps in. Governments soon realized the scandal threatened not just companies, but the stability of transport infrastructure. Special task forces were created, combining railway detectives, police, and financial auditors. Raids became more frequent. In one dramatic operation in Hamburg, authorities seized an entire warehouse filled with printing equipment and counterfeit stubs. The haul included more than 20,000 forged tickets ready for distribution. Newspapers hailed the raid as a victory, but within weeks, new forgeries appeared on trains hundreds of miles away. The forgers' resilience frustrated officials. Each crackdown seemed only to scatter the network, making it harder to dismantle entirely. Stories of betrayal. As investigations spread, betrayals came to light. A respected station master in Belgium was discovered to have sold blank ticket rolls to counterfeiters for years. A printer once employed by the railways was caught moonlighting as a supplier of forged paper stock. Even passengers, ordinary clerks, farmers, and students found themselves prosecuted when caught knowingly using counterfeits. The scandal no longer looked like the work of isolated criminals. It revealed cracks in society itself. The temptation of easy profit or cheap travel drew in people from every class. Respectable professions brushed shoulders with criminal networks. The boundaries between honest worker and forger blurred uncomfortably. The trial of the mastermind. At last, the conductor's testimony led investigators to the supposed mastermind, a former ticketing clerk named Karl Reinhardt. He had once worked at a railway depot, dismissed for minor theft. Instead of fading into obscurity, he transformed his insider knowledge into an empire of counterfeit. When Reinhardt was arrested in 1880, the press swarmed. His trial revealed the inner workings of the scandal, his use of authentic ticket books as models, his recruitment of skilled engravers, and his system of bribing railway staff to look the other way. Testimonies described him as both charming and ruthless, able to convince desperate workers to join him with promises of easy wealth. The courtroom was packed. Merchants, travelers, and railway officials all gathered to witness the downfall of the man blamed for bleeding the railways dry. Yet even as the trial unfolded, counterfeit tickets continued to circulate. Reinhardt was a symbol, not the entirety of the crime. A public divided. The scandal divided public opinion. Some saw Reinhardt as a villain who had endangered the very lifeline of commerce and mobility. Others, especially among the working poor, regarded him almost as a folk hero who had humbled the mighty railway barons. Cheap travel, they argued, had been a benefit for ordinary people, even if it came through illicit means. This tension complicated the authorities' efforts. Convicting Reinhardt might punish one man, but it could not resolve the broader complicity of a society willing to participate in the shadow economy he had built. The cliffhanger. The trial of Reinhardt seemed poised to end the scandal, but investigators soon realized that his empire was only one branch of a larger tree. His associates had scattered, carrying plates, presses, and methods with them. The counterfeit trade lived on, evolving and spreading into new regions. The scandal had grown beyond any single mastermind. Could justice truly dismantle a crime so embedded in both society's poverty and its ingenuity? Or would the forged tickets continue to ride the rails long after Reinhardt was locked away? Would you like me to continue to Section 3 of Story 5? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal, Section 3, 502,000 words. Story 5. The Railroad Ticket Forgery Scandal. Section 3. Resolution and Legacy. By the time Karl Reinhardt was put on trial, the forgery scandal had already spread beyond the reach of a single courtroom. His testimony and eventual conviction gave the public a face to attach to the crime, but the network of counterfeiters was far too entrenched to vanish overnight. The trial and conviction of Karl Reinhardt. Reinhardt's trial lasted nearly 6 weeks. Witnesses included former railway clerks, passengers who had unknowingly purchased forged tickets, and fellow counterfeiters who had accepted leniency in exchange for testimony. The prosecution painted Reinhardt as a calculating manipulator who had exploited the weaknesses of the railways for his own enrichment. The defense, however, attempted to frame him as a scapegoat. They argued that the railway companies themselves bore responsibility for failing to safeguard their ticketing systems. If paper slips can be so easily copied, one lawyer thundered, is it truly forgery we should condemn, or negligence? Despite such arguments, the court found Reinhardt guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and corruption. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, a punishment intended to send a message. Newspapers called it the end of the railway ticket scandal. But those close to the system knew better. The persistence of the problem. Even after Reinhardt's imprisonment, counterfeit tickets continued to surface. Smaller operations, inspired by his methods, sprang up across Europe. Each raid or arrest disrupted one cell, only for another to emerge elsewhere. The problem was not one man, but the system itself. Railway companies scrambled to innovate. Some introduced thicker, color-coded tickets to differentiate routes. Others used perforated edges that machines, rather than clerks, stamped into each ticket, making them harder to duplicate. In France, one railway experimented with embossing machines that left raised marks on tickets, nearly impossible to forge without specialized equipment. These changes worked for a time, but each innovation prompted new adaptations from forgers. The scandal had transformed into an ongoing battle of ingenuity, railway against counterfeiter. A broader shift in security. By the late 19th century, the scandal had influenced industries beyond railways. Banks, postal services, and even theaters began adopting stricter ticketing measures, drawing lessons from the railway debacle. Watermarks, serial numbers, and multi-layered printing techniques became more common. Some historians argue that the ticket forgery scandal accelerated the development of modern security printing. What had begun as a railway crisis pushed multiple industries to treat small slips of paper with the same seriousness as money. The social dimension. But the scandal was not merely technical, it was deeply social. For many, forged tickets had been a way to access opportunities otherwise denied to them. Workers could visit distant relatives, laborers could seek employment in other towns, and students could travel cheaply to universities. The counterfeit market had revealed both the desperation of the lower classes and the inaccessibility of legal travel. In response, some railway companies quietly lowered prices for short-distance routes. Others introduced discounted fares for workers, hoping to undercut the counterfeit market. These measures did not eliminate forgery, but they reduced its appeal among the poor. The scandal, in other words, had forced railways to confront their role not only as transport providers, but as gatekeepers of mobility. The last great raid. In 1885, police in Vienna carried out what became known as the Last Great Raid. Acting on intelligence, they stormed a hidden print shop disguised as a furniture warehouse. Inside, they found printing presses, stacks of forged tickets, and ledgers detailing profits stretching back years. The raid dismantled one of the largest surviving forgery operations in Central Europe. Its leader, a printer named Otto Weiss, was arrested and sentenced alongside his accomplices. Newspapers proclaimed that the era of ticket forgery had ended. In truth, smaller operations lingered, but the large-scale networks that had once rivaled the railways' own distribution were gone. Legacy in law and culture. The scandal left a lasting mark. Legislators introduced harsher penalties for counterfeiting not just money, but any official transport or government-issued document. Police units specializing in financial crime expanded their scope to include transport fraud. Culturally, the scandal became folklore. Ballads were sung about riding the rails on the forger's fare. Satirical cartoons depicted wealthy railway barons losing sleep over small scraps of paper. Reinhardt himself, though disgraced, became a figure of grim fascination, portrayed alternately as a criminal genius and as a working-class rebel. Reflections on trust. At its core, the railroad ticket forgery scandal was about trust. The railways had built their empire on paper slips that represented not just money but mobility. The forgers exploited that fragile trust, reminding society how easily systems could collapse when honesty was assumed rather than secured. For the passengers, the scandal posed uncomfortable questions. How many of them had knowingly purchased forged tickets? How many had looked away, treating the crime as harmless because it benefited them personally? And for the companies, it forced a reckoning with their own practices. Could they balance profit with accessibility? Could they design systems resilient enough to withstand both desperation and deceit? The thought that lingers. The scandal eventually faded into history, overshadowed by new challenges: mechanized ticketing, the rise of automobiles, and later, electronic systems. Yet its echoes remain. Every barcode, every holographic strip on a modern ticket, every digital check-in system carries within it the legacy of that 19th century crisis. Because in the end, the forgery scandal was not just about paper tickets. It was about the human instinct to exploit loopholes, the ingenuity of those on both sides of the law, and the fragile line between convenience and chaos. And so the question lingers. If even a simple slip of paper could destabilize an entire industry, what does that say about the systems we still trust today? White heavy checkmark. End of story 5. The railroad ticket forgery scandal. Would you like me to continue with story 6, section 1? You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is story 6. The Swindler of the Small Town Bank, section 1, 502,000 words. Story 6. The Swindler of the Small Town Bank. Section 1. The Quiet Theft. In the late 19th century, banks were more than financial institutions in small towns. They were symbols of stability. They held the savings of farmers, merchants, and workers, often acting as the linchpins of entire communities. To deposit one's wages or to secure a loan was not merely an economic act, but a vote of trust in the institution and the individuals who ran it. It was this trust that one man, a seemingly ordinary clerk named Jonathan Pierce, would exploit so thoroughly that the scandal of his swindle would ripple far beyond his modest town. A trusted clerk. Pierce had been with the First National Bank of Springfield, Ohio, for nearly a decade. Quiet, punctual, and unobtrusive, he was the sort of employee no one thought twice about. He handled ledgers, assisted with deposits, and greeted customers with practiced politeness. His salary was modest but steady, and he was considered reliable enough to manage the bank's books without constant oversight. To neighbors, he was unremarkable, a bachelor in his late 30s who rented a small apartment above a grocer's shop. He attended church on Sundays, nodded courteously to townsfolk, and lived without extravagance. Few suspected that behind his bland exterior, Pierce was studying the vulnerabilities of the very institution that trusted him most. The method of the swindle. Bank fraud in the 19th century was often dramatic: masked robberies, armed gangs, or sudden disappearances. Pierce's crime, however, was of a quieter kind. He discovered early on that discrepancies in the bank's ledgers could go unnoticed if he manipulated them carefully. His method was simple but effective. When customers deposited money, he would record the transaction in their passbooks correctly, but in the bank's master ledger he would reduce the amount slightly, perhaps by $5 or $10. The difference went into his pocket. The customer believed their funds were secure, and unless they demanded a full reconciliation with the bank's records, they never noticed the loss. Pierce expanded the scheme gradually. He skimmed from deposits, padded withdrawals with fictitious fees, and created small, phantom accounts in which he could shuffle money to disguise missing funds. Because the amounts were small and spread across many accounts, the irregularities blended into the background of everyday bookkeeping errors. Greed in small doses. What made Pierce especially dangerous was his patience. Unlike reckless swindlers who stole large sums and fled, he siphoned off small amounts consistently, year after year. Over a decade, he amassed a fortune that far exceeded what his meager salary could have provided. Yet outwardly, he did not flaunt it. Investigators later discovered that he invested quietly in real estate, purchasing properties under false names. He bought farmland, rented out houses, and even owned shares in local enterprises, all without drawing suspicion. His wealth grew silently, hidden in plain sight. The first whispers of trouble. The scandal began not with a dramatic discovery, but with a farmer named Samuel Hayes. Hayes had deposited several $100s, his savings from a year's harvest. When he attempted to withdraw funds months later, the bank's records showed a balance lower than what his passbook indicated. At first, the discrepancy was dismissed as clerical error, but Hayes insisted, producing his passbook as proof. The bank corrected the mistake, but the incident planted seeds of doubt. Soon, other customers began noticing similar issues: balances that didn't quite align, sums that seemed to vanish into thin air. The whispers spread quickly through Springfield. Trust, once unquestioned, began to fray. An internal audit. Alarmed, the bank's directors ordered an internal audit. For weeks, Pierce worked side by side with auditors, presenting ledgers and explanations. His calm demeanor reassured many, and his explanations of clerical mistakes seemed plausible. But the more deeply auditors dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. Some accounts appeared to have duplicate entries. Others showed transactions that made no sense, like withdrawals on days when the customers swore they had not visited the bank. The phantom accounts caught the auditor's attention. They were listed under names no one in town recognized. Piece by piece, the auditors realized they were not dealing with mere carelessness, but with deliberate manipulation. The moment of suspicion. The turning point came when one auditor noticed that nearly all the questionable entries passed through Pierce's desk. The handwriting on suspicious ledger entries matched his. The phantom accounts were opened under his supervision. He was the common denominator in every thread of irregularity. Still, the directors hesitated. To accuse a trusted clerk of embezzlement was a serious step. The town's confidence in the bank was already shaken. A scandal could cause a run on deposits, crippling the institution. And so, for several tense weeks, the directors debated in secret. Could they afford to expose Pierce? Or would it be better to quietly dismiss him and cover the losses themselves? The public begins to notice. While the directors hesitated, rumors spread. Farmers gathered at the tavern whispered of missing funds. Merchants compared notes about unexplained discrepancies. Each story fed the fire. Soon, townsfolk began withdrawing their money en masse. Lines formed outside the bank as people demanded their deposits. The directors, desperate to stem the panic, finally authorized a full-scale investigation. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Ledger after ledger revealed patterns of theft too consistent to ignore. The sum total shocked even the auditors. Tens of thousands of dollars had vanished over the years, a staggering amount for a small-town bank. And at the center of it all was Jonathan Pierce, the quiet clerk who had blended so seamlessly into the background. The cliffhanger. The evidence pointed to Pierce, but the question remained. How had he managed to steal for so long without being caught? What had driven him to such a meticulous and patient crime, and where had the missing money gone? As suspicion closed in on him, the townsfolk wondered, would Pierce confess, flee, or fight to the end to protect his secret? Would you like me to continue to section 2 of story 6? You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is story 6. The Swindler of the Small Town Bank, section 2, 502,000 words. Story 6. The Swindler of the Small Town Bank. Section 2. The Unraveling. When the auditors finally laid out the evidence, the directors of the First National Bank of Springfield could no longer deny the truth. Jonathan Pierce, the quiet man who had managed the ledgers for nearly a decade, had betrayed them. Yet exposing him risked more than humiliation. It risked the stability of the town itself. The arrest of Jonathan Pierce. The directors debated late into the night in a closed-door session. Some argued that the bank should quietly dismiss Pierce and repay the stolen money out of reserves, hoping the public never learned the full scope of the scandal. Others insisted that justice demanded exposure. In the end, the decision was taken out of their hands. News of the discrepancies had already reached the county sheriff through a concerned depositor. Within days, armed with warrants, lawmen entered the bank and escorted Pierce away. The scene stunned Springfield. Customers gathered on the street outside, craning their necks to see the arrest. Mothers pulled their children close as if a dangerous outlaw had been captured, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Pierce, one merchant muttered, the man who never raised his voice. The image of him, pale and silent in the sheriff's custody, would linger in memory long after the crime itself faded. The evidence builds. Once seized, Pierce's desk and apartment were searched. The findings left little room for doubt. In his drawers lay scraps of paper with calculations that mirrored the missing sums. In his apartment, tucked beneath floorboards, investigators discovered a small fortune in banknotes. But this was only a fraction of the total. The real revelation came when auditors traced his hidden investments. Under false names, Pierce had purchased farmland across the county, shares in 2 mills, and several rental properties. Each had been quietly profitable, generating steady income streams. The irony was staggering. Pierce had stolen money not to spend recklessly, but to build an invisible empire of quiet prosperity. Pierce's silence. Throughout interrogations, Pierce spoke little. He neither confessed nor denied. His only remark when pressed was chillingly detached. "You trusted the system more than the people. That was your mistake." The statement baffled investigators. Was he excusing his actions as a critique of banking practices? Or was it a taunt to those who had overlooked his crime for so long? The town's reaction. As the details emerged, Springfield was consumed by a storm of outrage, fascination, and betrayal. Customers demanded to know if their deposits were safe. Farmers feared bankruptcy. Merchants debated pulling their funds and storing them in safes at home. The newspapers seized on the story, branding it the quiet theft of Springfield. Headlines across Ohio painted Pierce as a banker bandit, though he had never carried a gun or staged a robbery. For many readers, the subtlety of his crime made it even more unsettling. At taverns and church steps, townsfolk argued. Some condemned Pierce as a thief who had jeopardized their livelihoods. Others, surprisingly, expressed a strange admiration for his patience and cunning. "He stole with a pen," one farmer remarked, "not a pistol, and he fooled them for 10 years. The trial begins. Pierce's trial commenced in the county courthouse, drawing crowds from surrounding towns. Spectators filled every bench, eager to witness the proceedings. The prosecution built a meticulous case, presenting ledger after ledger with falsified entries. They called upon farmers, merchants, and even widows who testified that their balances had mysteriously dwindled. Each witness painted Pierce as a manipulator who preyed on the trust of his neighbors. The defense, however, sought to muddy the waters. They argued that banking practices of the time were sloppy, that discrepancies were common, and that others could have been responsible. They painted Pierce as a convenient scapegoat, a quiet clerk blamed for systemic failings. But the evidence was damning. Handwriting analysis, property deeds, and hidden caches of money all tied back to him. Pierce's reputation in question. As testimony unfolded, a more complicated portrait of Pierce emerged. Former colleagues described him as diligent but distant, a man who rarely engaged in small talk. Neighbors recalled his solitary walks at dusk, his curt nods, his avoidance of social gatherings. The prosecution framed this isolation as evidence of his duplicity, proof that he had been hiding something all along. The defense, meanwhile, suggested it showed a man of modest habits, unfairly maligned because he did not fit the mold of friendly small-town life. The jury listened carefully, but the weight of the financial records seemed to drown out any ambiguity. The question of motive. Perhaps the most intriguing question in the trial was why. Pierce had not squandered his gains on luxury. He owned no fine clothes, no carriages, no extravagant furnishings. His apartment remained as sparse as ever. Some speculated he was driven by resentment, that years of low pay and lack of recognition had embittered him. Others believed he was motivated by a cold, mathematical desire for independence, quietly constructing a fortune without ever leaving Springfield. Pierce himself offered no insight. When asked directly why he did it, he merely stared ahead in silence. His refusal to explain became almost as famous as the crime itself. A community divided. Outside the courthouse, Springfield wrestled with its feelings. Some depositors lost everything. Others were reimbursed after painful delays. The directors, their reputations tarnished, struggled to reassure the public. For many townsfolk, the scandal shattered their trust not only in banks, but in the idea that small-town life was immune to deceit. If a familiar face like Pierce could be corrupt, who else might be hiding behind a mask of respectability? The cliffhanger. As the trial neared its conclusion, the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward conviction. But rumors swirled. Had Pierce hidden more money still undiscovered? Was he working alone, or had others in the bank quietly abetted him? The jury would soon decide his fate, but the mystery of his motives and the full extent of his secret fortune remained unresolved. Would you like me to continue to Section 3 of Story 6? You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is Story 6, The Swindler of the Small-Town Bank, Section 3, 1, 502,000 words. Story 6, The Swindler of the Small-Town Bank. Section 3, The Reckoning. The trial of Jonathan Pierce had gripped Springfield for months. From the moment the quiet bank clerk was led away in handcuffs to the final days of testimony, the town seemed to hold its breath. Yet even as the jury prepared to deliberate, one truth lingered. No verdict could fully repair the fracture of trust his crime had left behind. The verdict. When the jury returned after 2 days of deliberation, the courtroom fell silent. Farmers who had lost their savings, merchants who feared ruin, and townsfolk who had once trusted Pierce all sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the words that would seal his fate. Guilty, the foreman declared on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of trust. The sentence came swiftly. Pierce would serve 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, a harsh but not unexpected punishment for a crime of such magnitude. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by hushed murmurs. Some nodded in satisfaction. Others whispered that the sentence was too light given the scope of his theft. Pierce himself stood motionless, his expression unreadable. He neither protested nor apologized. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply replied, "The numbers tell their own story. I don't need to add to them." Life behind bars. At the penitentiary, Pierce was placed among thieves, swindlers, and violent offenders. Yet he was not treated like an ordinary prisoner. His reputation as the quiet thief preceded him. Guards and fellow inmates regarded him with curiosity. Unlike bank robbers who carried pistols and risked their lives, Pierce had wielded only a pen. Reports from the prison suggested that he spent his days in the library, poring over books on mathematics and philosophy. He rarely spoke to others, and when he did, it was often about abstract concepts of trust, numbers, or systems. Some inmates mocked him, others respected his intelligence. The fate of his fortune. While Pierce served his sentence, authorities worked to untangle the web of his hidden assets. Some farmland was reclaimed, some rental properties seized, and a portion of the missing money returned to the bank. But not all could be recovered. Even after exhaustive searches, investigators suspected that significant sums remained unaccounted for, perhaps hidden in secret caches, perhaps transferred under names and deeds no one could trace. The mystery of the missing fortune became a local legend, whispered in Springfield for decades. Farmers would joke that if you dug deep enough on the outskirts of town, you might strike not oil, but Pierce's buried money. The bank's struggle. For the First National Bank, the scandal was nearly fatal. In the immediate aftermath, panicked depositors withdrew their savings in droves, leaving the institution dangerously underfunded. The directors, desperate to survive, sought emergency loans from larger banks in Cincinnati and Columbus. The bank limped forward but never fully regained its stature. Competitors seized the opportunity, and many Springfield residents moved their accounts elsewhere. The phrase, "don't trust too easily," became a refrain, echoing in every conversation about money or business. Springfield's memory. Years after the trial, Pierce's crime remained etched in the town's collective memory. Children grew up hearing warnings about him. Don't be fooled by quiet men with steady hands. For older residents, the scandal became a touchstone in conversations about betrayal and vigilance. The courthouse where he was convicted became a place of uneasy pride. Visitors would point to it and say, "That's where they tried the bank clerk who fooled the whole town." Some even expressed admiration for his patience, though it was always tempered with condemnation for the harm he caused. Pierce's release. After serving nearly 10 years, Pierce was released in the early 1900s. By then, Springfield had changed. New businesses had risen, old ones had fallen, and the town had grown warier in its dealings. Pierce, now in his late 40s, was a free man but not a welcomed one. He returned briefly to Springfield, staying in a boarding house on the edge of town. Curious neighbors gathered outside to glimpse him, whispering about his gaunt frame and graying hair, but few dared speak to him directly. Within weeks, he vanished. Some claimed he moved to another state under an assumed name. Others insisted he lived quietly on land he had hidden from authorities. Sightings were rumored for years, but none confirmed. Pierce seemed to dissolve into the same silence that had defined his life. Reflections on trust and deception. The legacy of Jonathan Pierce was more than missing money or foreclosed farms. His crime exposed vulnerabilities in small-town banking, how easily trust could be exploited, how fragile financial systems were without proper oversight. Banks across Ohio and beyond introduced stricter auditing practices, requiring independent checks and balances that made it harder for a single clerk to manipulate records. In this way, Pierce's theft, though devastating, forced reforms that would protect countless others in years to come. On a human level, his story reminded Springfield of a sobering truth. Deception does not always come in violent or dramatic forms. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, nods politely, and carries a ledger. The lasting mystery. Yet questions lingered. Why had Pierce done it? Why not flee with the money once his fortune was large enough? Why invest in properties he could not openly claim? Was it greed, resentment, or a perverse sense of satisfaction in outsmarting everyone around him? And most tantalizing of all, where was the rest of his fortune? These questions, left unanswered, became the ghostly shadow of the scandal. For decades after, townsfolk speculated. Some swore that abandoned barns or hidden wells on the outskirts of town concealed Pierce's caches. Treasure hunters occasionally dug in fields rumored to have been his. None ever found definitive proof. Closing reflection. The story of Jonathan Pierce, the swindler of Springfield, endures not because of the sums he stole, but because of the lessons it left behind. It was a reminder that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. That vigilance is necessary even in the most ordinary corners of life, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest secrets. You are left to wonder, was Pierce a petty thief who got lucky, or a calculating mastermind who managed to vanish with a hidden fortune that may never be uncovered? White Heavy Checkmark Story 6 is now complete. Would you like me to begin Story 7? The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine, Section 1. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is Story 7. The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine, Section 1, 502,000 words. Story 7. The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine. Section 1. A Pillar of the Community. In many towns at the turn of the 20th century, the local pharmacist was not simply a vendor of remedies. He was a figure of trust, a bridge between doctor and patient, and often the only accessible source of medical advice for families who could not afford regular physicians. In one quiet Midwestern town, that figure was Edward Hargrave, a man whose calm demeanor and steady hands gave comfort to generations of townsfolk. But Hargrave was hiding a truth that would unravel lives, expose systemic weaknesses in medical oversight, and leave a stain on the very profession that prided itself on care. His story is not one of violent crime or dramatic heists, but of betrayal through quiet tampering, the dilution of medicine meant to save lives. The man behind the counter. Edward Hargrave inherited the town's apothecary from his father in the 1880s. He was a second-generation pharmacist, trained formally in chemistry, but also steeped in the old traditions of mortar and pestle, tinctures, and handwritten prescriptions. To the people of the town, he was more than a merchant. Farmers brought their children to him for cough remedies. Women sought his advice on tonics for fatigue. Men came in for liniments to soothe aches after long days of work. His manner was patient and fatherly. He listened to complaints and always seemed to know exactly which powder, syrup, or pill to dispense. His reputation was so solid that few ever questioned him. When doctors moved through the town on circuit visits, they praised him as a reliable partner. When new settlers arrived, townsfolk advised them, Go to Hargrave. He'll take care of you. Subtle beginnings of a crime. Yet beneath the polished wood shelves and neatly labeled jars, a different reality was taking shape. By the 1890s, Hargrave had begun quietly altering the strength of his medicines. Morphine solutions, quinine powders, digitalis tinctures, all were subtly weakened with fillers, water, or cheaper substitutes. At first, he justified it as a matter of economy. Imported drugs were expensive and profits slim. Dilution allowed him to stretch his inventory to meet demand without bankrupting the business. Better weak medicine than none at all, he told himself. But soon, economy gave way to greed. As the practice continued, Hargrave found he could pocket substantial sums by ordering smaller quantities of genuine ingredients and supplementing them with cheaper powders. The townspeople, unversed in chemistry, never noticed. They trusted his labels, his words, his prescriptions. Early signs of trouble. At first, the effects were subtle. A tonic took longer to relieve fever. A pain remedy seemed less effective than before. Patients attributed it to the severity of illness or the limitations of medicine in general. After all, cures were never guaranteed. But as the years passed, whispers began to circulate. Families complained of prescriptions not working like they used to. A doctor, puzzled, remarked that quinine from Hargrave's shop seemed weaker than the same medicine purchased in a neighboring town. Still, no one suspected fraud. Illness was common and outcomes varied, and Hargrave's reputation as a caring, dependable man shielded him from suspicion. A town's dependence. What made his crime particularly insidious was the town's dependence on him. Rural areas lacked hospitals, and physicians often visited only a few days each month. For the rest of the time, Hargrave was the frontline of healthcare. His word determined whether a child received life-saving treatment, whether a fever was properly managed, whether a laborer could recover from injury. In this environment, his decision to dilute medicine was not a simple matter of business dishonesty. It was a gamble with human lives, and the consequences would begin to show. Tragedy strikes. The first major tragedy tied to Hargrave's tampering came in the winter of 1897. A diphtheria outbreak swept through the town, affecting dozens of children. Doctors prescribed antitoxin serum, a relatively new and expensive treatment. Hargrave, in turn, supplied the medicine. Parents, desperate to save their children, trusted him implicitly. Yet some children recovered while others, receiving doses from the same batch, worsened and died. Whispers began to spread that the serum was uneven, inconsistent. A traveling doctor later confirmed that the antitoxin he examined seemed diluted. The grieving families were left with haunting questions. Had their children died because of the illness alone, or because the medicine meant to save them had been weakened by the very man they trusted most? Hargrave's calm defense. When confronted informally, Hargrave dismissed concerns. He claimed the serum varied in potency because it was still a new and imperfect science. He assured townsfolk that he did everything within his power to provide care at a reasonable cost. His calm explanations, paired with the aura of authority he carried, convinced many. But not all. A handful of doctors began keeping private notes, comparing the outcomes of patients treated with medicines from Hargrave's shop versus supplies obtained elsewhere. Patterns began to emerge: slower recoveries, weaker effects, unexplained failures. Suspicion grew, but evidence was hard to obtain. After all, who in the town had the means to test chemical purity? The pharmacist was the expert, the gatekeeper of knowledge. The turning tide. The true unraveling of Hargrave's scheme would come not from grieving families or rival doctors, but from a clerk in his own shop. Young Samuel Baines, hired as an apprentice, admired Hargrave at first, but as he learned the trade, he began to notice discrepancies. Containers of opium tincture ran out slower than expected. Barrels of cheap fillers disappeared into back rooms. Labels were sometimes swapped late at night. At first, Samuel thought little of it. Perhaps these were standard practices. But after witnessing Hargrave dilute a bottle of morphine with water before handing it to a desperate father, Samuel could no longer ignore his doubts. Late one evening, Samuel began keeping his own secret records. He logged shipments, compared them to sales, and noted which medicines Hargrave altered. It was a risky move, one that would put him at odds with his employer and mentor. The question unanswered. By the turn of the century, murmurs of doubt surrounded Hargrave more openly. Some still defended him as a hardworking man doing his best in difficult times. Others wondered aloud whether he had betrayed the very trust that sustained him. But the truth had yet to break into the open, and Samuel's hidden records remained locked away in his desk. The town waited, unknowingly, for the moment when suspicion would harden into undeniable proof. Closing thought for Section 1. How long could Edward Hargrave continue to dilute medicine under the veil of trust? And when the truth finally emerged, would justice come swiftly? Or would the town remain bound by its loyalty to a man who had quietly profited from their pain? Would you like me to continue to Section 2 of Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine, Section 2, 1, 502,000 words. Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine. Section 2, Suspicion, Exposure, and the Breaking Point. The first section ended with a question. How long could Edward Hargrave continue to dilute medicine under the cover of trust? The answer came slowly, as suspicion grew into investigation, and private doubts transformed into public confrontation. A town divided. By 1901, the cracks in Hargrave's reputation were visible, though still whispered more than spoken aloud. Some families insisted that his medicines worked no better than sugar water, while others fiercely defended him, citing recoveries they attributed to his remedies. Doctors were divided too. A few supported Hargrave, arguing that failures in treatment were simply part of medicine's limitations. Others, however, had seen too many weak tinctures, too many patients who seemed mysteriously resistant to drugs that should have worked. The town was caught in a strange bind. Distrust of the pharmacist meant distrust of the very foundation of their health care. To accuse him outright was to accuse the institution that had long served them. And so suspicion festered, unspoken, beneath the surface. Samuel's growing resolve. Inside the apothecary, Samuel Baines, Hargrave's apprentice, grew increasingly uneasy. He had now collected over a year's worth of records, discrepancies between supply orders and what was dispensed, substitutions of cheaper powders, bottles of morphine and digitalis visibly watered down. Each entry in his log felt like a weight on his conscience. Yet Samuel hesitated. To accuse Hargrave would mean betraying his employer, the man who had taught him the trade. It would mean risking his own livelihood, perhaps even his safety. Still, Samuel's resolve deepened after a particular night in the winter of 1902. A frantic mother arrived at the shop, begging for quinine for her fever-stricken child. Hargrave sold her a diluted batch, assuring her it was strong enough. Days later, Samuel heard that the child had died. He could no longer dismiss his suspicions as exaggerations. A chance encounter. The turning point came when Samuel confided his doubts to Dr. Clara Whitfield, one of the few female physicians in the region and a sharp critic of Hargrave's methods. Dr. Whitfield, already uneasy about the pharmacist's practices, encouraged Samuel to share his records. For the first time, Samuel allowed another pair of eyes to examine his meticulous notes. Dr. Whitfield compared them with her own patient records, and the patterns were undeniable. Medicines from Hargrave consistently underperformed compared to those sourced elsewhere. Dr. Whitfield urged Samuel to act, but he hesitated. Without laboratory testing, suspicion was not proof. The town would need hard evidence. The testing of medicines. Evidence arrived almost by accident. In the spring of 1902, a traveling chemist visited the town to demonstrate new laboratory equipment. Samuel and Dr. Whitfield saw their chance. Quietly, they obtained samples of Hargrave's stock, quinine, morphine, digitalis, and asked the chemist to test their purity. The results confirmed their worst fears. The quinine was barely a quarter of its proper strength. The morphine solution was diluted almost to uselessness. Even simple aspirin powders were bulked up with chalk. For Dr. Whitfield, it was the final piece of the puzzle. For Samuel, it was the moment he knew he could no longer stay silent. The first accusations. When Dr. Whitfield presented her findings to the town's medical board, the reaction was explosive. Some members were outraged, demanding immediate investigation. Others cautioned restraint, fearful of destroying the community's trust in its only pharmacist. Word spread quickly. Families who had long whispered their suspicions now spoke openly. Parents whose children had died during outbreaks demanded answers. Farmers accused Hargrave of profiteering while they suffered. But Hargrave himself remained calm, even indignant. He denied the accusations flatly, insisting the chemist's tests were flawed and that his medicines were genuine. He accused Dr. Whitfield of ambition and Samuel of betrayal. A court of public opinion. With no official regulatory body strong enough to act, the case spilled into the court of public opinion. Town meetings grew heated. Neighbors who once shared meals now shouted across aisles. Some insisted Hargrave had saved their lives. Others accused him of being a murderer in disguise. Hargrave himself gave speeches, standing on the steps of his apothecary, reminding people of the decades he had served them. He cast himself as a victim of jealousy and slander. Many believed him. But behind closed doors, the evidence was mounting. Samuel produced receipts, showing how Hargrave had ordered less medicine than he dispensed. Dr. Whitfield brought in more samples, tested in neighboring cities, with the same damning results. A fatal epidemic. Then fate intervened. In the fall of 1903, another outbreak swept the town, this time of typhoid fever. Dozens fell ill. Hargrave dispensed remedies as he always had, but the death toll mounted alarmingly fast. Grieving families demanded investigations into the medicines given. Samples of Hargrave's stock were seized and tested again. The results left no room for doubt. The remedies had been watered down to near uselessness. The town could no longer look away. Even his staunchest defenders struggled to explain away the evidence. Hargrave's arrest. In November 1903, Edward Hargrave was arrested on charges of fraud and manslaughter. The town gathered to watch as the man who had once been its most trusted figure was led away in shackles. Some wept, unable to reconcile the kindly pharmacist with the crimes he was accused of. Others muttered darkly, insisting justice had come too late. Hargrave maintained his innocence. "I sold what was given to me," he insisted. "If the medicines were weak, blame the suppliers, not me." Yet his ledgers told another story, revealing purchases that did not match the stock he dispensed. The trial approaches. The stage was set for one of the most contentious trials the town had ever seen. Witnesses lined up to testify, grieving parents, doctors, even Samuel himself. For the first time, the community would hear, in a formal courtroom, the evidence that their trusted pharmacist had betrayed them. But before the gavel struck, a lingering question remained. Would a jury, many of whom owed their lives to Hargrave's care, be willing to condemn him? Or would loyalty and doubt obscure justice once again? Closing thought for Section 2. The trial promised to pit loyalty against truth, memory against evidence, and faith against science. Would the town finally face the depth of betrayal, Or would Hargrave find a way to twist trust into acquittal? Would you like me to continue to Section 3 of Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, here is Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine, Section 3, 502,000 words. Story 7, The Pharmacist Who Diluted Medicine. Section 3, Trial, Judgment, and the Legacy of Betrayal. The town had braced itself for scandal, but few could have predicted how consuming the trial of Edward Hargrave would become. The case was not just about one man's guilt. It was about whether an entire community could accept that trust had been exploited for profit and power. The trial opens. The courthouse filled beyond capacity when proceedings began in January 1904. Farmers, tradesmen, and grieving families crowded the benches, while reporters from nearby cities jostled for space along the walls. The prosecution framed Hargrave's crime simply. He had sold watered-down medicine knowingly, and people had died as a result. The defense countered with equal force. Hargrave's lawyer argued that poor storage conditions, flawed suppliers, and even patient neglect could explain the weak remedies. He painted Hargrave as a scapegoat, a man too convenient to blame for the natural tragedies of disease. Witnesses for the prosecution. One by one, witnesses testified. Mothers wept as they recalled giving children medicine that did nothing, watching helplessly as fevers rose. Farmers told of paying full price for remedies that were later proven to be little more than chalk and water. Doctors spoke with clinical precision, presenting patient records that showed disturbing patterns. Dr. Clara Whitfield's testimony was particularly devastating. With calm authority, she explained how she had compared Hargrave's medicines to those from other towns, finding the same batches consistently weaker. Her words carried weight, not just for their detail, but for her reputation as one of the few physicians who had publicly challenged Hargrave before the scandal broke. Finally, Samuel Baines took the stand. With trembling hands, he presented his ledger of records, pages filled with careful notes, side-by-side comparisons of orders and dispensations. The evidence revealed a systematic pattern of dilution, too deliberate to be dismissed as error. Hargrave's defense. When Hargrave rose to testify, he was calm, almost defiant. He admitted that some remedies might have been weaker, but denied that he had ever deliberately diluted them. He blamed inconsistent suppliers, changes in chemical potency during transport, and even the patients themselves for failing to follow instructions. His closing remark was chilling in its confidence. "If I were guilty, would I not have fled long ago? No, I stayed because I know my conscience is clear." For some in the gallery, his words reignited doubt. Could the man they had trusted for decades truly be guilty of such betrayal? The jury's decision. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman's voice shook as he read the verdict: guilty on multiple counts of fraud, and guilty of manslaughter in relation to the deaths linked to his diluted medicines. The courtroom erupted, sobs, gasps, and shouts blending into a storm of emotion. Hargrave, however, remained composed. He turned briefly toward the gallery, his expression unreadable, before being led away in shackles. The sentence. The judge handed down a sentence of 20 years imprisonment, a near life term given Hargrave's age. Some believed it too lenient, others too harsh. But the message was unmistakable. Betrayal of trust in medicine would not be excused. Aftermath in the town. The trial left scars deeper than any single verdict could heal. Families continued to debate Hargrave's guilt long after the courtroom emptied. Some clung to the belief that he had been framed, while others could not forgive the losses tied to his name. The pharmacy itself was shuttered. For months the shop stood empty, its shelves bare, a ghostly reminder of betrayal. Children whispered as they passed by, calling it the poison place. Dr. Whitfield stepped into the void, organizing a cooperative effort to bring in new medicines from verified suppliers. Over time, trust in the town's healthcare began to rebuild, though it was never again blind or unquestioning. National repercussions. News of Hargrave's conviction spread far beyond the town. Newspapers across the country seized on the story of the pharmacist of frauds. Public outrage pressured lawmakers to strengthen oversight of pharmacists and apothecaries. By 1906, new regulations required standardized dosages, clearer labeling, and stricter inspections. The case became one of several catalysts for sweeping reforms in the pharmaceutical industry, part of a movement that would eventually give rise to modern drug safety laws. The legacy of betrayal. Edward Hargrave never confessed. He served his sentence quietly, reportedly maintaining until his final days that he had been misunderstood, a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of fraud. When he died in prison, his name was already synonymous with betrayal. For the town, his legacy was a cautionary tale. Parents warned children about the dangers of blind trust. Doctors spoke openly about the need for accountability, and pharmacists across the region found themselves held to higher standards than ever before.